She was born unwanted, and she became unforgettable, and she died under circumstances that have haunted us for over 60 years. But to understand the mystery of Marilyn Monroe's death, we have to start with the girl she was before the world knew her name. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded little freak! Today, this is a very highly requested video. A lot of you guys watched or listened to my Princess Diana deep dive video, and a lot of you requested I do the lovely Marilyn Monroe next. So here we are. Please let me know what other videos you guys want to see. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into the life and mysterious death of Marilyn Monroe. On June 1st, 1926, in the charity ward of Los Angeles General Hospital, a baby girl was born at approximately 9:30 a.m., and her birth certificate bore the name Norma Jean Mortensen, though she would later be baptized Norma Jean Baker. And her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, was a 24-year-old film negative cutter who named her daughter after silent screen star Norma Talmadge. Or so the story went. But Marilyn's half-sister, Bernice, would later dispute this in her 1994 memoir, claiming the name came from a family friend, Norma Jean Cohen Seidman. And the father, listed on the birth certificate, Martin Edward Mortensen, Gladys's estranged second husband, was almost certainly not the biological father, because he had separated from Gladys months before conception and would later insist he never consummated the marriage. And the true father, as DNA evidence confirmed in 2022, was Charles Stanley Gifford, Gladys's supervisor at Consolidated Film Industries. And when she became pregnant, he wanted nothing to do with her or the child. And at 18, Norma Jean finally tracked down his telephone number, and his response was devastating, saying, quote, "I'm married, I have a family, I don't have anything to say to you. See my attorney," unquote. Which is just so incredibly heartbreaking, like to track down your father and for him to just tell you to contact lawyers and he doesn't want to deal with you like you're a speck of dust that's just annoying to him. It's just horrible. Not a great way to start out life. And she would even try twice more to meet him, traveling to his dairy farm in Hemet, California in 1950 and again in 1961. And there could be more meetups, but we don't know for sure. But both those times, he refused to see her. And if all that wasn't enough already, mental illness also saturated Gladys's bloodline. And her father, Otis Monroe, had died in an asylum from syphilis, and her mother, Della, suffered from what would today likely be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. And a great-grandfather had also died severely mentally ill. So 12 days after giving birth, Gladys placed Norma Jean with Albert Wayne and Ida Bolender, a deeply religious evangelical couple in Hawthorne, California, who took in foster children for $5 a week. And Norma Jean would spend 7 years calling them Aunt Ida and Uncle Wayne, believing for much of the time that they were her actual family. And when the child instinctively called Ida Mama, the woman corrected her sharply, saying, "Don't call me mother. I'm not your mother." Let's calm down a little bit. It's a fucking child, all right? But oddly enough, even though she had that reaction, the Bolenders did want to adopt her, but Gladys refused. And what Norma Jean didn't know was that she had siblings as well. And Gladys's first marriage to Jasper Newton Baker had produced 2 children, Robert Kermit Jackie Baker and Bernice. And when that marriage collapsed in 1923, Jasper basically kidnapped both children and fled to Kentucky. And Jackie died in August of 1933 at 15 from kidney disease, shattering Gladys's fragile equilibrium. And Norma Jean and Bernice finally met in autumn of 1944 and formed a genuine bond. So in the summer of 1933, Gladys purchased a small white bungalow at 6812 Arbel Drive in Hollywood. And she took in lodgers, a British couple named George and Maud Atkinson, both actors, to help with the mortgage. And for a few months, mother and daughter lived together, but it would last less than a year. And in January of 1934, Gladys suffered a complete mental breakdown. and would be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and committed to Norwalk State Hospital. And she would spend the rest of her life cycling in and out of psychiatric institutions, eventually outliving her famous daughter by more than 2 decades before dying in 1984. But over the next several years, Norma Jean lived in approximately 12 different foster homes. So on September 13th, 1935, 9-year-old Norma Jean became ward number 3,463 at the Los Angeles Orphans Home Society at 815 North El Centro Avenue in Hollywood, better known as Hollygrove. And she remained until June 12th, 1937. And from the dormitory windows, the children could see the RKO Studios water tower. Quote, "I used to think there must be thousands of girls sitting alone like me, dreaming of becoming a movie star. But I'm not going to worry about them. I'm dreaming the hardest," unquote. She would later say, reflecting on those moments where she was staring at the water tower. And the Atkinsons took her first for roughly 16 months. And something happened in the house she would never fully articulate. And she developed a severe stutter and became withdrawn. And psychiatrists say now that there could have been some abuse in that household that would have caused her to develop a stutter and to withdraw, but nothing is confirmed. But in another home, it would be confirmed that a boarder did abuse Norma Jean. And when she reported it, her foster mom slapped her face, saying, "I don't believe you. Don't you dare say such things about that nice man," unquote. So she had an incredibly rough childhood. And Grace McKee, Gladys's best friend, became Norma Jean's legal guardian in 1936. And Grace adored movies and was obsessed with Jean Harlow, saying, quote, "Someday you'll become an important woman," unquote. She would tell little Norma Jean, quote unquote, a movie star. But Grace's own life was chaotic, and she married Irvin, or Doc, Goddard, who allegedly 11-year-old Norma Jean in 1937 as well. So she's going to multiple houses, and she's getting taken advantage of by these men that she thinks she should be able to trust, and they severely let her down and cause decades worth of trauma. And Grace's aunt, Anna Lower, provided the one true bright spot. And Norma Jean would live with Anna in Sawtell from 1938 to around 1941. Saying, quote, "She changed my life," unquote. Monroe would say later in life. And she would also go on to say she was a wonderful human being. But not everything was darkness, because she excelled in English class and she loved writing and contributed to the school newspaper at Emerson Junior High. The girl who emerged from those 12 foster homes and that orphanage dormitory was not merely damaged, she was determined. And at the window of Hollygrove, watching the RKO water tower catch the California light, she had made herself a promise. She would dream harder than anyone and become someone the whole world would want. So in 1942, 15-year-old Norma Jean faced abandonment again. And Grace McKee Goddard's husband had been transferred to West Virginia, but California law prevented them from taking their ward out of the state. And the alternative was Hollygrove, the orphanage. But Grace would have another idea. The Goddard's neighbors included the Daughtry family, whose son James was a handsome 21-year-old working at Lockheed Aircraft. And Grace approached Jim's mother with a business proposition. If Jim married Norma Jean, she wouldn't have to return to the orphanage. And Jim would later insist genuine affection developed between them after a Christmas dance in late 1941. But the primary catalyst was desperation, not romance. So now she's just getting sold off to a random guy. Although, not to go back to the orphanage, but now she's got to be married to this guy, this random guy. But anyway, on June 19th, 1942, 18 days after her 16th birthday, Norma Jean became Mrs. James Daughtry at 432 South Bentley Avenue in Los Angeles, with a reception at the Florentine Gardens. And to marry, she dropped out of University High School. And the marriage wasn't miserable, and Jim was fundamentally decent. It was just said to be ordinary. And she called him Daddy, which is a term revealing more than she intended about what she was searching for. She had no really good father figure in her life, so now her husband when she's a child right now, but her husband's kind of becoming her father. It's just really messed up. And years later, she would assess it honestly, saying, quote, "My marriage didn't make me sad, but it didn't make me happy either. Actually, our marriage was a sort of friendship with privileges," unquote. But in April of 1944, Jim shipped out with the Merchant Marine. And rather than wait passively, Norma Jean got a job at the Radioplane Munitions Factory in Van Nuys, inspecting parachutes and spraying airplane parts with fire retardant for $20 a week. Different times, I tell you what. And for the first time, she was earning her own money. And in late 1944, Army photographer David Conover arrived at the factory, dispatched by Captain Ronald Reagan's 1st Motion Picture Unit to shoot female war workers for morale purposes. Because those guys needed pictures of gals, you know what I'm saying? And Conover spotted a pretty girl putting propellers on airplanes, saying, quote, "She had curly ash blonde hair and her face was smudged with dirt. I snapped her picture and walked on. Then I stopped stunned. She was beautiful," unquote. And he spent the next 2 weeks teaching her how to pose, recognizing something she had always suspected about herself. So by August of 1945, Norma Jean walked into the Blue Book modeling agency, run by Emmeline Snively. And Snively's assessment was measured. Pretty, but not exceptional. Better suited for pinup work than high fashion. But there was something the camera might capture. And Norma Jean threw herself into the work with surprising intensity. And by early 1946, she appeared on approximately 33 magazine covers. And Snively saw unrealized potential, saying, quote, "You've just got to bleach and straighten your hair. Because now your face is a little too round and a hair job will lengthen it," unquote. Different time. I mean, not really. Even modeling agencies today, I feel like they're even more brutal. So maybe it's actually pretty light. But in February 1946, photographer Raphael Wolf paid for the transformation because he needed a blonde for a shampoo ad. And at Frank and Joseph's beauty salon, her brown curls were chemically straightened and lightened. And even her widow's peak was removed through electrolysis. But her blonde hair would become perhaps the most famous physical characteristic of the 20th century. So Jim Daughtry, her husband at the time, asked her to give up modeling because he wanted the teenage bride he'd left behind. But she now had a taste for attention and possibility and the first glimmers of her childhood dream. Guy was wanting to hold her back, all right? And in 1946, she filed for divorce in Las Vegas. And the decree was finalized on September 13th, 1946, exactly 11 years to the day after she'd been admitted to Holly Grove as ward number 3463. And Jim would learn that his marriage was over while aboard a ship on the Yangtze River. That's rough. God, that's gotta be rough. Like, let her live her dreams, but I guess there was no other way to tell him. At least she told him. She just didn't go off and run around, you know what I mean? But he would later become an LAPD detective and the department's first SWAT trainer, giving interviews about Norma Jean until his death in 2005. But by the end of 1946, Norma Jean was 20 years old, newly divorced, and standing at a crossroads. His magazine covers paid the bills, but magazines weren't movies. And the RKO water tower she'd stared at through the Holly Grove window was no longer just a symbol, it was a destination. So the man who would give Norma Jean a new name had once starred alongside the original blonde bombshell. And Ben Leon was a Fox executive in 1946, but 2 decades earlier, he'd appeared opposite Jean Harlow in Hell's Angels. And when the 20-year-old model walked into his office that summer, he felt the past reaching forward. Quote, "It's Jean Harlow all over again," he would say. And Leon arranged a screen test without full approval from studio head Daryl F. Zanuck. And it was filmed in July of 1946 at 5:30 a.m. on a deserted soundstage belonging to a Betty Grable picture. And cinematographer Leon Shamroy, a 4-time Academy Award winner, watched through his viewfinder as Norma Jean walked across the set, sat on a stool, and lit a cigarette. And she wore a floor-length sequined gown, no lines, purely visual. And Shamroy described what he saw in near mystical terms, because most people looked worse on screen, like your girl here, right? That's why I stand so far back from the camera, you know what I'm saying? All right. But Marilyn Monroe looked better. And the camera just loved her in a way that couldn't be taught. But Zanuck remained unimpressed. But when RKO showed interest in signing her, he agreed to a contract rather than lose her to a rival. So on August 24th, 1946, Norma Jean signed with 20th Century Fox for $75 a week. And Leon suggested Marilyn after Marilyn Miller, the legendary Ziegfeld Follies star. And for the surname, she chose her mother's maiden name, Monroe. And other names had been considered like Carol Lind, Claire Norman, Meredith, but Monroe felt right. And the legal change wouldn't come until February 1956, but from August 1946 onward, Marilyn Monroe had taken Norma Jean's place. So Marilyn Monroe was born, and years later she would reflect on what the old name represented, saying, quote, unwanted, shy, an orphanage slave, Marilyn would later say, but Marilyn Monroe would be wanted by everyone. So the first 6 months at Fox were spent in classes, acting, singing, dancing, and she also enrolled at the Actors Laboratory Theater, a school with progressive political leanings that would later cause problems during the Red Scare. And their assessment was discouraging, which was too shy and too insecure. So when her contract came up for renewal in August of 1947, Fox declined to extend it. But Columbia Pictures signed her in 1948, hoping to create another Rita Hayworth. And she began working with drama coach Natasha Littess, a Berlin-born teacher who would become one of the most important and controversial figures in her personal life. And Columbia gave her one film, Ladies of the Chorus, a low-budget musical. And it was her first starring role. She could sing, she could move, and she had presence. But none of it was enough. And in September of 1948, Columbia dropped her too. And 2 studios had now decided Marilyn Monroe wasn't worth keeping. But what saved her career was a man who fell hopelessly in love with her, Johnny Hyde. Now, Johnny Hyde was a vice president at the William Morris Agency who had helped build the careers of Rita Hayworth and Lana Turner. And he was 53, married, and suffering from a serious heart condition. And when he met Marilyn in 1949, he had around 2 years to live. But Hyde became convinced she was destined for stardom and set about making it happen. And he paid for acting classes, clothing, cosmetic dental work, and he secured auditions impossible for an unsigned actress. And he begged her to marry him. I feel really bad for his wife, promising his fortune. But Marilyn refused, and she wouldn't marry a man she wasn't in love with, not even for security. But the orphan who had married at 16 to escape institutionalization had grown into a woman with principles. And in 1950, Hyde delivered the 2 auditions that changed everything. So the Asphalt Jungle, directed by John Huston, gave Marilyn perhaps 5 minutes of screen time as the young mistress of a corrupt lawyer. And Huston had resisted casting her initially, suspecting Hyde was pushing his girlfriend. But when she auditioned, the nervous young woman disappeared, saying, quote, Marilyn didn't get the part because of Johnny, unquote. Huston said later, quote, she got it because she was damned good, unquote. And critics singled out the unknown blonde as a revelation. And All About Eve truly announced her arrival. And Joseph Mankiewicz's masterpiece starred Bette Davis, Anne Baxter, George Sanders, and Celeste Holm. And Marilyn played Miss Claudia Coswell, a graduate of the Copacabana School of Dramatic Art. And it was a small role, but she played the dumb blonde with such precision that audiences couldn't tell if she was in on the joke. And that ambiguity suggested depth beneath the surface. So watching her hold her own among titans, Zanuck finally understood what Lyon had seen 4 years earlier. And Fox offered a new contract, but this time they meant to keep her. So the early 1950s became a blur of increasingly prominent roles, with Don't Bother to Knock in 1952, which gave her a rare dramatic lead as a disturbed babysitter, and then came 1953, the year that transformed her from promising newcomer to a phenomenon. And Niagara cast her as a femme fatale plotting her husband's murder, and it was the first time her name appeared above the title. And Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, one of my favorites, paired her with Jane Russell, the centerpiece, and Marilyn descending a staircase in a pink gown singing "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend." Oh, I love that movie. If you haven't seen it, you gotta go watch it, all right? And it became one of the most iconic sequences in cinema history. And How to Marry a Millionaire teamed her with Betty Grable and Lauren Bacall. So 3 massive hits in a single year. So the orphan from Holly Grove had become the biggest movie star in the world. So Natasha Lytis remained her primary drama coach, present on nearly every set. And directors despised her constant presence, but Marilyn refused to work without her. And in 1955, that dependence shifted to Lee and Paula Strasberg. And Lee ran the actor studio in New York, the temple of method acting where Brando and Dean had trained. And for those of you who don't know, the method demanded excavation of personal trauma in service of character. And for Marilyn, who had more trauma than most, it was both liberating and dangerous. And the Strasbergs would remain central to her life until her death. And Lee would inherit the bulk of her estate. And in January of 1955, Marilyn did something unprecedented. She announced the formation of Marilyn Monroe Productions with photographer Milton H. Green. And Time called her a shrewd businesswoman. And Fox was forced to renegotiate her contract, granting approval over scripts and directors, which were rights virtually unheard of for any actor, let alone a woman in the 50s. So the company produced Bus Stop in 1956 and The Prince and the Showgirl in 1957, and her performance in Bus Stop earned a Golden Globe nomination and the best reviews of her career. So by the late 1950s, Marilyn transcended movie stardom. And the white dress billowing over a subway grate in The 7-Year Itch, filmed in 1954, and was released in 1955 and had become perhaps the most famous image in cinema history, also one of my favorites. But she proved she was more than the photograph with Some Like It Hot. And Billy Wilder's 1959 comedy cast her opposite Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon as Sugar Cane. And the shoot was notoriously difficult, and her insecurities required dozens of takes for simple scenes. But the finished film was a masterpiece. And Marilyn won the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Comedy, the only major award of her career. So she had reached the pinnacle. 33 years old, the most famous woman in the world, finally recognized as a legitimate artist, but she was falling apart. But to understand why she was falling apart, we need to step back a couple steps. So the marriage that America wanted to believe in lasted exactly 274 days. This is when Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio exchanged vows at San Francisco City Hall on January 14th, 1954. The press called it the marriage of the century. The baseball legend and the blonde bombshell, 2 icons joining their lives. And they had met in 1952. Marilyn expected a flashy New York sports type and was surprised to find a reserved, almost shy man who didn't make a pass at her right away. And that restraint intrigued her. She was so used to people just throwing themselves at her because she was the sex icon of the century. But DiMaggio took her to family dinners, introduced her to his Italian relatives, showed her what domestic life might look like. And for a woman who had never known a real family, the vision was intoxicating. But DiMaggio wanted a wife, not a movie star, not a sex symbol. He imagined she would be content with a quiet life in San Francisco away from Hollywood, and he would be catastrophically wrong, as we've seen this in the past with the other guy who wanted to bring her down. Joe DiMaggio was just as bad, if not worse. But their honeymoon took them to Tokyo. And when Marilyn made a side trip to Korea to perform for troops, over 100,000 soldiers gathered, she returned to the hotel glowing, saying, quote, "Joe, you've never heard such cheering." And his reply was, "Yes, I have." Bombastic side-eye, okay? But this exchange would capture everything that would doom them, because DiMaggio had walked away from that type of worship, and he just couldn't understand why she couldn't. But her career was just starting, and she was freaking queen. Come on. I mean, obviously you could leave whenever you want to, but don't hold her back, man. Don't hold her back. But the breaking point came in September 1954, filming The 7-Year Itch, when Marilyn stood over that subway grate where a fan blew her white dress up around her thighs. And take after take, the crowd cheered. But somewhere in the crowd stood DiMaggio, watching strangers leer at what he considered his. And the fight that night was reportedly savage. And on October 6, 1954, Marilyn filed for divorce on grounds of mental cruelty, as you should, Queen. And I mean, Joe DiMaggio can be with whoever he wants to be. I feel like this is a Reddit thing where it's like, you can prefer a woman that's not a movie star, but don't make her feel bad. You married a movie star sex symbol, like amazing woman. Like, what do you want? Just classic controlling man. Come on. So Marilyn would pick herself back up and she would eventually meet someone else, Arthur Miller. And Arthur Miller was everything DiMaggio wasn't: intellectual, politically engaged, and celebrated for his mind. And he had written Death of a Salesman and The Crucible, and they first met in 1951, introduced by Elia Kazan, but Miller was married back then. And when Marilyn moved to New York in 1955, they reconnected. And for her, Miller represented validation, one of America's great literary minds seeing past the image to the woman beneath. And when Variety announced their relationship with Egghead Wed's Hourglass, it's an odd title, but okay, the crude headline captured how the world saw them. And they married twice in June 1956, a civil ceremony on the 29th and a Jewish ceremony 2 days later. And Marilyn had converted to Judaism without pressure from Miller, keeping a mezuzah on her door and a menorah that played Hatikva. And Egypt would ban her films because of this conversion. And she would describe herself as a Jewish atheist for the rest of her life. So on their honeymoon in England, filming The Prince and the Showgirl, she found Miller's diary, and the specific contents have never been fully revealed, but Miller had written something expressing disappointment, doubts about who she really was, perhaps frustration with her insecurities. And the man she married because he saw the real her had apparently found the real her lacking, and the marriage never fully recovered. And Marilyn suffered multiple miscarriages, each deepening her depression. And she would eventually become increasingly dependent on barbiturates to sleep, and amphetamines to wake, and alcohol to blur her pain. So in 1960, filming Let's Make Love, she had an affair with co-star Yves Montand. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. And both were married, and the affair was passionate but brief. And Montand returned to his wife, and Marilyn was left more alone than before. And the marriage ended January 24th, 1961, and Miller eventually would not even attend her funeral. So after that divorce, her career would continue, but she would finally meet the famous JFK in 1954, introduced by Peter Lawford, who was married to Kennedy's sister, Patricia. And the most plausible account of intimacy with the president places it on March 24th, 1962, at Bing Crosby's Palm Springs estate. And her masseur, Ralph Roberts, claimed she called him that night with JFK's voice audible in the background. And Roberts said Marilyn told him this was their only encounter, a single night, not an ongoing affair. But the night that cemented her Kennedy connection in public imagination came on May 19th, 1962, at Madison Square Garden, celebrating JFK's 45th birthday. And Marilyn wore a dress so tight and nude-colored, she'd appeared to be wearing nothing. A sheer gown encrusted with rhinestones looked like they were sewn onto her body, and her delivery of "Happy birthday to you" was slow, sensual, and almost parodic. If you haven't seen it, you need to go watch it immediately. And Kennedy would joke afterwards saying, "I can now retire from politics after having had happy birthday sung to me in such a sweet, wholesome way," unquote. Guy was going, "Ooh, ooh, ooh, my wife's here, oh, you know? Goddamn. And the only known photograph of Marilyn and JFK together was taken at the after party, and Robert Kennedy's involvement is murkier. And housekeeper Eunice Murray eventually admitted, decades later, after years of denials, that of course Bobby Kennedy was there, and of course Bobby Kennedy had an affair with her. So she was... The Kennedys really liked Marilyn Monroe. But Murray's shifting accounts make her unreliable, so we don't know for sure. That's its own conspiracy theory. But what seems clearer is that in the weeks before Marilyn's death, both Kennedy brothers cut off communication completely. So that makes me think, maybe there was something going on. Maybe one brother got jealous of the other brother being with Marilyn Monroe. But who's to say? We'll get into it. So The Misfits released February 1961 and was supposed to be her triumphant dramatic showcase. And screenplay by Arthur Miller, cast including Clark Gable, Montgomery Clift, and Eli Wallach, directed by John Huston. But the shoot was a disaster, and Marilyn was barely functional, hospitalized mid-production. And Miller watched his marriage disintegrate while rewriting scenes to accommodate her incapacity. And Gable would push through despite a heart condition, and he would actually die of a heart attack days after filming Wrapped. And his widow would blame Marilyn's chronic lateness. And the finished film is haunted by mortality, and it would be the last completed film for both Monroe and Gable. And Something's Gotta Give in 1962 embodied everything wrong with her final years. Cast opposite Dean Martin, she missed day after day, often incapable of performing when she did appear. And on May 19th, she left the set to sing Happy Birthday to the President. And on June 8th, Fox fired her for spectacular absenteeism. So the biggest star of the 1950s was dismissed like a temperamental nobody. But remarkably, she won. And by late June, Fox hired her with a substantial raise. And filming would resume in October, but she would never make another film. So in February 1962, Marilyn purchased the first home she ever owned, 12305 5th Helena Drive in Brentwood, a Spanish-style property for around $75,000 US. And she decorated it sparsely, never really finishing. A tile at the entrance bore a Latin inscription, Cursum Perficio, I am finishing my journey. And the phrase has haunted biographers since. And she would live there 6 months before she died. So her primary psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, began treating her in January of 1960. And rather than maintaining clinical distance, he integrated Marilyn into his family life, believing she needed normal family bonds her childhood had denied. And he prescribed enormous quantities of medication, barbiturates at 3 times the maximum recommended dose, while trying to wean her off Nembutal by switching to chloral hydrate. This guy was off his rocker. And her internist, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, provided additional prescriptions on top of her other prescriptions. And the doctors had agreed to consult each other, but Marilyn learned to manipulate both of them, obtaining medications without the other's knowledge. So she had a way of manipulating both of them, as well as them being clearly just not great doctors, in my opinion. And in February 1961, she was committed to Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York, believing she was going for rest. But instead, she found herself in a locked ward, placed in a padded cell. And her letter describing the experience was harrowing. Cement blocks, bars on windows, screaming women, and she threatened harm if they didn't release her. But Joe DiMaggio would rescue her. So despite their divorce, he flew from Florida immediately, demanded her release, and threatened to tear the building apart. He came through. DiMaggio came through. And she would be transferred to Columbia Presbyterian for 3 weeks, because DiMaggio had never really stopped loving her. And in the months before her death, he was increasingly present, and he may have even proposed remarrying. This is something her niece would claim Marilyn planned to accept. But from early July through August 4th, 1962, Marilyn saw Dr. Greenson 27 times in 35 days, and Dr. Engelberg 13 times. And accounts of her mental state are contradictory. Some describe her as hopeful, energized by her Fox victory. Others describe despair and woman unraveling. And Greenson's notes paint a dark picture, full of fears, depressions, feelings of worthlessness. And she told him she felt like a waif, that people only wanted her for what they could get. And both Kennedy brothers had cut off contact. And on the night of August 3rd, she dined at La Scala with Peter Lawford and publicist Pat Newcomb. And the dinner was tense, and Newcomb stayed overnight. And on the morning of August 4th, Marilyn called a friend about disturbing overnight phone calls, someone threatening her to, quote-unquote, leave Bobby alone, calling her a tramp. So she was naturally nervous and exhausted, and it would be her last full day alive. So the sun rose over Brentwood on Saturday, August 4th, 1962, promising another perfect Southern California day. And at 12305 5th Helena Drive, Marilyn Monroe had barely slept, and she had spent the night tormented by phone calls, at least according to what she told her friend Jean Carmen around 6 a.m. An unidentified woman had called repeatedly through the night, delivering the same venomous message, quote-unquote, leave Bobby alone. And the caller had used other words too, like tramp, whore, and the vocabulary of jealous rage. And Marilyn was shaken, exhausted, and her nerves frayed before the day had properly begun. And Carmen would remember that she sounded, quote-unquote, nervous and exhausted. And this was not unusual for her in those final months, but something about this morning felt different. And the threats had rattled her in a way that suggested she took them seriously. And by 8 a.m., housekeeper Eunice Murray had arrived. And Murray was an unusual presence, hired not through normal channels but on Dr. Greenson's recommendation, because he wanted someone trustworthy keeping an eye on his most famous patient. And Murray reported back to Greenson regularly, a surveillance arrangement Marilyn may or may not have fully understood. But the morning unfolded with mundane rhythms. Handyman Norman Jeffries arrived to continue tiling the kitchen floor, and Marilyn drank grapefruit juice, and deliveries came and went, a bedside table, and citrus trees for the garden. And the actress who had captivated the world puttered around her small house like any other homeowner on a Saturday morning. So Pat Newcomb had slept over the previous night and didn't wake until nearly noon. And this became a point of friction, because Newcomb was Marilyn's publicist and, in theory, her friend. But when she emerged having slept soundly, Marilyn's mood curdled, and the star herself had barely slept, and the threatening calls, the chronic insomnia, and the cocktail of medications that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. So seeing Newcomb well-rested while she was ragged and exhausted triggered something, and the two women argued. And the official explanation was jealousy over sleep, but those who knew the situation suspected the real tension lay elsewhere, because Newcomb had connections to the Kennedy family, and she knew things about Marilyn's relationship with both brothers. So whatever words passed between them, the friendship was strained to its breaking point. And photographer Lawrence Schiller arrived to discuss business, nude photographs from Something's Got to Give that might be sold to Playboy. Even in her final hours, the machinery of her image continued grinding forward. And Dr. Greenson arrived at approximately 4:30 p.m. for what would be their final session. And he found Marilyn in a state that concerned him, because she appeared drugged, sedated, and not quite present. Wonder whose fault that is. And he would ask Newcomb to leave, and what transpired between doctor and patient will never be known with certainty. And Greenson would later tell investigators that Marilyn seemed depressed, but not alarmingly so, because he had seen her in worse states. And he also had seen her rally from dark moods before. So the session lasted several hours, and when Greenson prepared to leave around 7 p.m., he made two decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. First, he asked Murray to stay overnight, a precaution suggesting he was more worried than his official account admitted. And second, he told Marilyn to take her Nembutal and get some rest. And then he left. And then Joe DiMaggio Jr. would call between 7 and 7:15 p.m. because the son of Marilyn's second husband had maintained a relationship with her after his father's divorce, and he was calling with news he knew that would please her. He had broken up with a girlfriend Marilyn hadn't approved of, and the conversation was apparently pleasant, even cheerful. And young DiMaggio would later tell investigators he detected nothing alarming, no slurring, no despair, nothing to suggest a woman on the verge of death. And this would become one of the central mysteries. Because if Marilyn was planning something terrible or already succumbing to a fatal dose of medication, how could she have sounded so normal just hours before she had passed away? And shortly after, around 7:40 p.m., Marilyn telephoned Greenson to share the good news about young Joe's breakup. And her mood, again, seemed improved, and Greenson would remember being reassured, as the Marilyn who rang up him sounded better than the one he had left an hour earlier. And then, around 8 p.m., Marilyn retired to her bedroom with her telephone, and the cord stretched under the door connecting her to the outside world. So sometime between 7:45 and 8 p.m., the exact time is disputed, the telephone rang at Peter Lawford's house, and Marilyn was on the line. And Lawford was hosting a dinner party and had called earlier to invite her. And now she was returning the call, but something was wrong. And her voice sounded strange, quote-unquote, weird, Lawford would later describe it, quote-unquote, fuzzy and sleepy. Her speech was slurred and her words drifting. And then she said something that would be analyzed for decades. Quote, "Say goodbye to Pat," unquote, she would tell him, referring to his wife, Patricia Kennedy Lawford. Quote, "Say goodbye to the president and say goodbye to yourself because you're a nice guy," unquote. And then the line went quiet. Not dead quiet, though, because Lawford could hear something on the other end, but Marilyn had stopped speaking, and he called her name, but there was no response. And alarmed, Lawford tried to call back, but the line was busy, or perhaps simply off the hook, and he called again and again, unable to get through. And what Lawford did next, or rather what he failed to do, would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case, because he did not drive to Brentwood. He did not call the police. Instead, he called his agent, Milton Ebbins, and asked for advice. And Ebbins suggested trying to reach Marilyn's doctor or lawyer, and Mickey Rudin, her attorney, eventually called the house between 9:30 and 10 p.m., and Eunice Murray answered and assured him Marilyn was fine, she was in her room, the light was on, everything was under control. So Lawford, reassured by the secondhand report, returned to his dinner party, which, I guess makes sense if somebody's calling and reassuring. But even then, I would be like, did you go into the room and check on her? Are you hearing her right now? I don't know. Hindsight's 20/20, but it seems odd. And he would spend the rest of his life regretting that decision. But here is where the official timeline begins to fracture, because according to Murray's initial account, nothing unusual happened for the next several hours, and she went about her business, assumed Marilyn was sleeping, and eventually went to bed herself. And then, around 3 a.m., she awoke, sensing something was wrong, and she would walk to Marilyn's bedroom door and saw light spilling from beneath it. And she knocked, but there was no response. And she tried the handle, but the door was locked. And concerned, Murray called Dr. Greenson, and on his advice, she went outside and looked through the bedroom window. And what she saw through the glass was Marilyn lying face down on the bed, unclothed, covered partially by a sheet, and the telephone receiver clutched in her outstretched hand. And she was motionless. And Greenson arrived at approximately 3:30 a.m., unable to open the locked door. And he broke a window with the fireplace poker and climbed into the room. And he checked Marilyn's body and found that she was, in fact, deceased. And rigor mortis had already set in, and she had been gone for hours at this point. And Dr. Engelberg arrived around 3:50 a.m. and officially confirmed the death. And at 4:25 a.m., a full hour after the doctors arrived, someone finally called the police. But this timeline has never made sense, because if Murray discovered Marilyn unresponsive around midnight, as she initially told some investigators before changing her story, why did she wait over 3 hours to call Greenson? And Murray's account shifted over the years, and she eventually admitted the bedroom door hadn't actually been locked, contradicting her earlier claims. And she admitted there were aspects of the evening she hadn't initially disclosed. And most dramatically, in a 1983 interview with journalist Anthony Summers, later published in his 1985 book, Goddess, she admitted on tape that Robert Kennedy had visited Marilyn's house that afternoon. So the housekeeper hired to watch over Marilyn was also, it seemed, watching over her secrets. So when police finally entered the bedroom, they found a scene described countless times, but never fully explained, because Marilyn lay face down on her bed, unclothed, with a sheet covering part of her body, and her hand was extended, clutching a telephone receiver as if she had been trying to call someone when death overtook her. Or perhaps the phone had simply been near her hand when she lost consciousness. And the bedside table held a pharmacy's worth of medication. 12 to 15 bottles. And among them was an empty bottle that contained 25 Nembutal capsules, prescribed just 2 days earlier, and a partially empty bottle of chloral hydrate sat nearby, with only 10 capsules remained from a prescription of 50. So if all that medication was taken, it would have been a massive unsurvivable dose, because the two drugs together were particularly lethal because each amplified the effects of the other. And there was also no note, and no signs of struggle. And questions were raised about whether she could have taken that many pills without more water present, because there was only a little glass of water on the counter. And her stomach, when autopsied, would prove empty. No visible residue of the dozens of capsules she had supposedly ingested. And the phone records that might have revealed who Marilyn called in her final hours, or who called her, disappeared. Conveniently. And Captain James Hamilton of the LAPD, who had connections to the Kennedy family, allegedly confiscated them, and they were never seen again. So at 4:25 a.m., Dr. Engelberg dialed the police and spoke the words that would shock the world. Marilyn Monroe has died. She's committed suicide. And the determination was made before any investigation had occurred, before any autopsy, and before any evidence had been properly examined. And in that first phone call, the narrative was already being established. And within hours, reporters descended on 5th Helena Drive. And the news spread across the country, and then around the world. The most famous woman of her generation was dead at 36, found alone in her bedroom, clutching a telephone surrounded by empty pill bottles. So the sun rose over Brentwood on Sunday, August 5th, 1962. But for Norma Jean Mortensen, the unwanted child, the orphan, the foster kid who had stared at the RKO water tower and dreamed the hardest, the journey had ended. And the mystery of how it ended was only beginning. So Sergeant Jack Clemens was the watch commander at the West Los Angeles Police Station when the call came in at 4:25 a.m. A woman was dead at 12305 5th Helena Drive. And the name meant nothing to him until dispatch added the detail Marilyn Monroe. And Clemens arrived within minutes, becoming the first law enforcement officer to view the scene. And what he found, and what he would later claim to have found, would fuel conspiracy theories for decades. Because the bedroom was small, modest by Hollywood standards, and Marilyn lay face down on the bed, her body positioned almost too perfectly. And the staging struck Clemens as odd. And in his experience, barbiturate overdoses didn't produce such composed death scenes, and victims typically vomited and thrashed. So this looked like someone had been arranged and possibly murdered. And Dr. Greenson and Dr. Engelberg were already present, along with Eunice Murray. And Clemens would later claim Murray was operating the washing machine when he entered, a very unusual activity for the middle of the night, suggesting perhaps that evidence was being laundered along with her linens. But Murray would deny this, and the discrepancy was never resolved. But Clemens asked questions and received answers that didn't really add up. In the timeline, discovery around 3:30 a.m. and police called at 4:25 a.m. left nearly an hour unaccounted for. And when he pressed, the responses were vague. Phone calls had been made, people had been notified, the delay was unfortunate but innocent, and the sergeant would leave troubled but without authority to investigate further. And years later, after retiring, Clemens became one of the most vocal proponents of the murder theory, insisting he had witnessed a cover-up in progress. And his credibility, however, proved complicated. And Clemens was a member of the Police and Fire Research Organization, an anti-communist group, and he was later indicted for conspiracy to libel a state senator and eventually resigned from the force. And whether his claims reflected genuine observations or ideological paranoia remained an open question. So Dr. Thomas Noguchi was 35 years old and still on probation when assigned to perform the autopsy on the most famous woman in the world. And it was an unusual choice. A case of this magnitude typically went to the chief medical examiner. Theodore Curfey, the chief coroner, oversaw the proceedings while delegating the actual cutting to his young deputy. And Noguchi approached the body with meticulous care, and he weighed her at 117 pounds, and he noticed advanced rigor mortis consistent with death occurring many hours before discovery, and he examined every inch of her skin for needle marks, checking elbows, forearms, between fingers and toes, the scalp, and the thighs, but he would find none, and no puncture wounds anywhere. But he found one superficial bruise on her lower back, insignificant enough to have come from bumping into furniture. And her organs appeared healthy, no signs of violence, no defensive wounds, and nothing to suggest a struggle. And then he opened her stomach, and like we said before, it was empty. And this finding would become one of the most debated aspects of this case, because Marilyn had supposedly ingested between 40 and 50 barbiturates, enough to fill a small cup, and the pills should have left some residue, but instead, Noguchi found nothing but hemorrhaging of the stomach lining, indicating irritation consistent with oral ingestion of a caustic substance. But the contradiction seemed impossible, because how could someone ingest dozens of pills and leave no trace? And defenders of this theory pointed out that chronic barbiturate users develop accelerated absorption rates. And critics countered that no absorption rate could eliminate all evidence of such a massive dose. And the liver told a different story, because pentobarbital levels measured 13.0 milligrams, dramatically higher than in the blood, indicating chronic or heavy barbiturate use over an extended period. Because Marilyn's body had been saturated with these drugs for so long, they had accumulated in her organs. And the blood work would reveal what had killed her, if not precisely how it entered her system. Chloral hydrate measured 8.1 milligrams, 80 parts per million, and the therapeutic range topped out at 30. So the lethal threshold was approximately 100, and Marilyn was at 80% of a fatal dose from this drug. And pentobarbital, the active ingredient in Nembutal, measured 4.5 milligrams, 45 parts per million, the therapeutic range extending to 12. So lethality began around 40. So she was 12% over the lethal threshold. But the numbers alone didn't capture the full picture, because chloral hydrate and pentobarbital were synergistic. Each amplified the other. So taking them together wasn't addition, it was multiplication. And the combined dose was catastrophically, unsurvivably toxic. And Dr. Noguchi drew samples for further testing, stomach contents, organs, blood, standard protocol for any questionable death. And these were sent to head toxicologist Raymond Abernathy for additional analysis. And then they disappeared. Abernathy destroyed them before supplementary tests were completed, and his explanation was bureaucratic. The case had been closed, samples were no longer needed, and storage space was limited. But the destruction meant certain questions could never be answered, because had the drugs been introduced orally, or was there another route? Rectal administration, injection into the muscle tissue, some method that wouldn't leave needle marks? Noguchi wasn't informed of the destruction until years later, saying, quote, "a great shame," unquote, he would say later on. And the loss haunted him for the rest of his career, reoccurring in nightmares where he was accused of complicity in whatever cover-up might have occurred. So Coroner Curfey recognized that determining manner of death required more than physical evidence, and he convened a you-know-what word that YouTube hates, prevention team, which were psychiatric experts who would examine Marilyn's mental health history and render an opinion on whether she was the type of person who might do that. So the team reviewed her records, interviewed her doctors, compiled a psychological profile. And their findings painted a picture of a woman in profound distress. Severe fears, frequent depressions, abrupt mood swings, and she had been taking sedative drugs for years and was well aware of their dangers. But most damningly, this wouldn't be the first time that she would do this, or attempt. Because on more than one occasion, she had taken pills, and too many of them, only to call for help and be rescued. So the pattern was established. Crisis, gesture, salvation. Perhaps she had followed the same pattern on August 4th, ingesting these pills, reaching for the phone, but this time, the rescue hadn't come. So she might have not actually wanted to do that, and she expected someone to come help her, which is equally as devastating. So on August 17th, 1962, Curfey announced the official finding, and that is that Marilyn Monroe had died of acute barbiturate poisoning due to ingestion of overdose. So the manner of death was classified a probable suicide. And the word probable was crucial because it acknowledged uncertainty and left room for doubt. And Noguchi himself was reluctant to rule definitively. But probable suicide became, in the public mind, simply suicide. So the investigation was remarkably cursory by modern standards, and questionable even by 1962 standards, because reportedly no fingerprints were taken from the pill bottles, and no forensic analysis was conducted on the drinking glass, and the crime scene was not secured, as people wandered freely in and out for hours before and after the police arrived. And the bedroom was cleaned, sheets changed, and potential evidence handled by multiple parties before anyone thought to preserve it. And most critically, Marilyn's phone records vanished. And these records would have shown exactly who she called on her final day and who called her. And they might have confirmed Peter Lawford's account or contradicted it. And they might have revealed whether Robert Kennedy had been in contact with her. And they might have explained the threatening calls she reported. And Captain James Hamilton of the LAPD Intelligence Division was later identified as the person who confiscated them. And as we said before, Hamilton had the connections to the Kennedy family, and he had provided security services during their Los Angeles visits. And crime reporter Jack Tobin would later claim Hamilton personally told him he possessed, quote, the telephone history of the last day or two of Marilyn Monroe's life, unquote. And the records were never seen again. So Joe DiMaggio would be the one to claim Marilyn Monroe's body. Despite their divorce 8 years earlier, he had never stopped loving her. And now he stepped forward to handle arrangements, determined to give her in death the dignity denied in life. And his first decision was exclusionary, and he banned virtually everyone from Hollywood, studio executives, celebrity friends, industry figures who have profited from her image while failing to protect the woman behind it. And DiMaggio held them responsible, saying, quote unquote, morally, if not actually, for her death. And the service was held on August 8, 1962 at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. And only 31 mourners attended, a startlingly small number for the most famous woman in the world. And DiMaggio was there with his son. And Marilyn's half-sister Bernice Miracle flew in from Florida, and Dr. Greenson attended with his family, and Lee Strasberg delivered the eulogy. And Arthur Miller did not attend. His third wife was 9 months pregnant, and he allegedly sent 2 bouquets instead. And the casket would be bronze, lined with champagne-colored silk, costing around $25,000 paid by DiMaggio. And Marilyn wore a green Emilio Pucci dress, one of her favorites. And her longtime makeup artist, Alan Whitey Snyder, prepared her face, and she had actually once made him promise that if she died before him, he would do her makeup one final time. And he needed gin to get through it. And the autopsy had damaged her hair, and Mortician's wife, Agnes Flanagan, used a wig to restore the famous blonde waves. And after the service, DiMaggio sat beside her open casket for hours, unable to leave. And when the moment came to close the lid, he broke down completely, kissing her and whispering, "I love you," over and over. And he would send roses to her grave 3 times a week for the next 20 years. So the official investigation concluded within weeks, but closure proved elusive. And almost immediately, alternative theories circulated. The Kennedy connection was whispered in Hollywood circles and discussed in newspaper columns and investigated by journalists who sensed a larger story. And the inconsistencies, timeline gaps, missing phone records, empty stomach refused to disappear. And Robert Kennedy's whereabouts on August 4th became a subject of intense speculation. And he was in the Los Angeles area that weekend for a family gathering at Lawford's beach house. And his wife insisted he was in San Francisco when Marilyn died, but witnesses would later claim to have seen him in Brentwood that afternoon, entering her house. And the FBI, which had maintained a file on Marilyn since 1955 due to her connection to Arthur Miller, monitored the conspiracy theories but apparently conducted no investigation. Classic FBI. And if Hoover possessed evidence linking the Kennedys to her death, it remained locked in private archives. And Eunice Murray quietly left the country for several months after the funeral, traveling to Europe, fueling speculation she had been paid to be unavailable for follow-up questions. And Greenson seemed haunted by his failure to save his most famous patient, because he had seen her that afternoon, recognized her vulnerability, asked Murray to stay overnight precisely because he was worried, and still she had died. And nearly all LAPD files related to Marilyn Monroe's death were destroyed in subsequent years, officially in compliance with departmental procedures. Yeah, shut the f*** up. Because the timing was never adequately explained, and routine files were purged periodically, but the death of the most famous woman in the world was hardly routine. And investigators who later sought access found almost nothing. And what survived were fragments, copies made by interested parties, notes preserved by individual officers, and documents that escaped the shredder. And these would become the foundation for every subsequent investigation, and every book, and every documentary, and every attempt to reconstruct what actually happened. And the deconstruction ensured that the full truth could never be established, and whatever secrets those files contained died with them. But beyond the conspiracy theories, there was simply grief, because millions of Americans had grown up with Marilyn Monroe, watching her on screen, buying magazines with her face, following her marriages and comebacks with the attention usually reserved for family. And she had been part of the lives in a way that transcended ordinary celebrity. And now she was gone, dead at 36 years old, and the loss felt personal even to people who had never met her. And letters poured into newspapers and fan clubs, and ordinary people tried to articulate what she had meant. Her beauty, yes, but also her vulnerability, and the sense that behind the glamorous facade was someone who struggled just like they did. Because she had made failure look survivable and loneliness look universal. And then failure and loneliness had taken her. But Marilyn Monroe had spent her life being wanted, and in death, she was mourned by a nation that had never truly known her, but felt somehow that they had lost someone essential. But in the immediate aftermath, most Americans accepted the conclusion, but acceptance eroded over time, because the 1960s brought assassinations that shattered public trust in official narratives. And JFK was killed in November 1963, and the Warren Commission's conclusion satisfied almost no one. And Robert Kennedy fell in 1968, and Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and Vietnam. Americans learned to distrust what their government told them about death. And we still do today. Where are the Epstein files? But in that climate of suspicion, Marilyn's probable looked less like a careful conclusion and more like a convenient one. And the Kennedy connections that had seemed like gossip in 1962 took on a new significance as the brothers themselves became victims. And if powerful forces had conspired to kill the president and his brother, might those same forces have silenced the woman who knew too much? And the conspiracy theories multiplied, and books appeared, and documentaries aired, and the official finding was never quite definitive. It became just one theory among many, endorsed by authority, but not necessarily by truth. But the conspiracies began before Marilyn Monroe's body was even cold. And in the hours between her death and the official announcement, while doctors and housekeeper were still constructing their timeline, whispers had already started circulating through Hollywood because something wasn't right, and the story didn't add up. And at the center of every widespread theory stood the same family name, Kennedy. And it would take years for these whispers to coalesce into published accusations, and decades for them to become a permanent feature on American conspiracy culture. But the essential elements were present from the beginning: the famous actress, the powerful brothers, and the inconvenient woman who knew too much. And it was a narrative that wrote itself, requiring only the willingness to believe that official explanations were lies. And whether any of it was true remained 6 decades later impossible to prove and equally impossible to dismiss. But the affair, or the affairs, that Marilyn allegedly conducted with the Kennedy brothers, with President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert, became the foundation upon which all the other conspiracy theories were built. And the evidence was substantial, but circumstantial. And Marilyn had known both brothers since the mid-1950s, moving in the same social circles through Peter Lawford, and she had attended parties at the Lawford Beach House, been photographed at political events, and cultivated connections to power that went beyond mere celebrity. And the Happy Birthday, Mr. President performance crystallized public suspicion into something approaching certainty. Because no woman sang to a man that way unless something was happening between them, or something did. You know, some fire was there, some spark was there. It was either a confession or a provocation, or possibly both. But what actually occurred between Marilyn and JFK remains disputed. And the relationship with Robert Kennedy was even murkier, because there was claims that he was there that day visiting Marilyn in her own home. But again, at this point, we don't know much else, other than all of this circumstantial evidence. But if the Kennedys, or forces acting on their behalf, had wanted Marilyn dead, what would have driven them to such extremity? Because first, there was the threat of exposure. Because Marilyn, the theory went, had grown tired of being used and discarded, and she was angry enough to threaten going public. A press conference was supposedly planned at which she would reveal everything. And this threat was existential for the Kennedys. And JFK's presidency was built partly on his image as a devoted family man. Aren't they all? No. And second, there was the question of what Marilyn knew. The Red Diary became a central artifact of conspiracy lore, a journal in which she allegedly recorded sensitive information gleaned from conversations with the Kennedy brothers, and nuclear secrets, and CIA plots to assassinate Castro, and details of the Bay of Pigs disaster. This diary included a lot of insane stuff, allegedly. And Lionel Gradinson, a former coroner's aide, claimed to have seen the diary, and his account was detailed, a red-covered notebook filled with political secrets and intimate confessions. But Gradinson had been fired from the coroner's office for stealing from corpses, and his testimony offered years later in exchange for payment could not be corroborated. And third, there was the simpler matter of reputation. Even without nuclear secrets, a public relationship between a Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe would have been scandalous, because the family had invested too much in their image of Catholic rectitude to allow it to be tarnished. And if Marilyn was murdered, how was it done? Because the empty stomach presented the central puzzle, and she had supposedly swallowed 40 or 50 capsules, yet no residue remained. And one theory pointed to suppository administration, and barbiturates introduced rectally, bypassing the stomach entirely, but this would have required cooperation or incapacitation from the victim. And the injection theory ran into a significant obstacle because Noguchi had examined her body exhaustively for needle marks and found none. And theories countered that certain sites might have been missed, or that a fine enough needle would leave no visible mark, and the destruction of tissue samples meant microscopic analysis could never be performed. Again, how convenient. And Donald Spotto, whose 1993 biography offered the most carefully researched alternative to proposed accidental death through medical negligence. And his theory held that Marilyn's doctors had failed to coordinate prescriptions, and she had manipulated Engelberg into prescribing Nembutal without Greenson's knowledge. And that evening, she took the Nembutal, and later, Greenson, unaware of what she had consumed, administered a chloral hydrate enema, a treatment method he reportedly used with some patients. And the combination would prove fatal. And in Spotto's scenario, the staging of the death scene wasn't a government conspiracy, but a cover-up by two physicians desperate to avoid malpractice consequences. This one's interesting as well. And the timeline discrepancies, the changed sheets, the delayed call to police, all could be explained by panicked doctors rather than CIA assassins. But beyond the Kennedys themselves, suspicion fell on the agencies that served and sometimes surveilled them. And the FBI had maintained a file on Marilyn since 1955, like we said before, and opened during her relationship with Arthur Miller. And documents released years later showed agents tracking rumors about her death. But the Bureau apparently conducted no investigation, and if Hoover possessed evidence linking the Kennedys to her death, he kept it locked away. And the CIA theories were more lurid but less substantiated. And Norman Mailer, in his 1973 book, speculated that FBI or CIA rogue elements might have killed her, perhaps revenge for the Bay of Pigs. And Mailer later recanted on 60 Minutes, admitting he had included it primarily to boost his book sales. Slimy! That's gross, dude. But his honesty didn't prevent the theory from taking on a life of its own. And wiretapping allegations added another layer, and Bernard Spindell, an electronics expert who had worked for the Teamsters, claimed he had bugged Marilyn's home on orders from Jimmy Hoffa, who wanted evidence of Bobby Kennedy's affair. And Fred Otash, a former LAPD officer and private investigator, made similar claims, and he had recordings of her final hours that would prove what really happened. But neither man ever produced these recordings. and the 1982 reinvestigation found the wiretapping claims baseless, but the allegations had already embedded themselves into conspiracy lore. And then, organized crime offered another set of suspects. Sam Giansana was the boss of the Chicago outfit, a man who moved between gangster circles and show business, and he shared a mistress with JFK, Judith Exner, and he allegedly participated in CIA plots to assassinate Castro. And his connection to Marilyn was tenuous. Both had visited Frank Sinatra's Cal Neva Lodge, but evidence they ever met remained circumstantial. And Jimmy Hoffa presented a more direct motive. And the Teamsters president despised Bobby Kennedy with a passion bordering on obsession, and an affair with Marilyn properly documented and exposed might have been a weapon against his enemy. And Milo Sparaglio alleged in 1982 that Hoffa and Giansana had conspired to kill Marilyn, and his evidence was thin. Hearsay, speculation, and unverifiable sources. And Darwin Porter claimed 5 mafia hitmen had entered Marilyn's home, subdued her with chloroform, and had administered a fatal barbiturate enema. And the scenario was cinematically vivid, but supported by nothing resembling credible evidence. But 20 years after Marilyn's death, the question had grown loud enough that authorities could no longer ignore them. And Los Angeles District Attorney John Van de Kamp ordered a threshold investigation, a review to determine whether a full criminal investigation was warranted. And lead investigator Ronald H. or Mike Carroll spent more than 3 months examining documents, interviewing witnesses, and evaluating conspiracy claims. And Carroll's 30-page report was definitive in rejecting murder theories. And the investigation found no credible evidence supporting a murder theory. I mean, they didn't have a lot of stuff to look at because a lot of it got destroyed, but all right. And Noguchi's autopsy was deemed competent, and the probable ruling was reasonably supported by data, and the witnesses who had promoted conspiracy theories were almost without exception unreliable, and the wiretapping allegations were investigated and found false, and the Red Diary either never existed or had never been seen by any credible witness, according to these people. And Grandison was dismissed as discredited. And the report acknowledged problems with the original investigation, saying, quote-unquote, factual discrepancies and unanswered questions remained. But the discrepancies and missing evidence did not equal murder necessarily, and Carroll's conclusion was stark. And it was, if Marilyn had been murdered, the crime would have required a massive in-place conspiracy involving everyone at the death scene, the coroner's office, and most of the LAPD officers assigned to the case. And such a conspiracy was theoretically possible, but practically incredible. If you know anything about the government now, though, anything's possible, isn't it? But Van de Kamp permitted himself editorial comment, quote, on the basis of the known facts, permit me to express the faint hope that Marilyn Monroe be permitted to rest in peace, unquote. She would not be. Because the conspiracy theory survived partly because their proponents were skilled at presenting discredited evidence as credible revelation. And Robert Slater claimed to have married Marilyn in a secret Tijuana ceremony in October of 1952. And the marriage, he said, lasted only 3 days before being annulled, but it made him a confidant who understood her better than anyone. And based on this knowledge, he concluded she was murdered. And the marriage almost certainly never happened, and no documentary evidence supported Slater's claim. And friends from that period had no memory of such event, but Slater was persistent and persuasive, and his story provided the foundation for books and documentaries, and the 1982 reinvestigation itself. And John Miner presented a different credibility problem, because he had been present at Marilyn's autopsy and had interviewed Greenson as part of the original investigation. And decades later, Miner claimed Greenson had played him audio tapes recorded by Marilyn herself. Tapes providing she was not willing to take her own life. But the tapes never surfaced, and Greenson had died by the time Miner was public. And Miner's credibility deteriorated under scrutiny, and he had lost his law license and lied about working for the Kinsey Institute, and gone bankrupt before selling his transcripts. And James Hall claimed to have been an ambulance attendant who responded before her death was officially reported. And in his account, she was still alive, comatose but breathing, when the ambulance arrived. And Greenson had injected adrenaline directly into her heart, but the injection killed her. Allegedly, that's what this guy's saying. But Hall failed a polygraph test, and he had been paid $40,000 by a tabloid, and his account contradicted the actual ambulance driver, Ken Hunter, who told the 1982 investigation that Marilyn was clearly dead when he arrived, and her body was cold, having been lifeless for quite some time. And all the conspiracy theories are still debated today. But at the end of the day, Marilyn Monroe had spent her life being looked at, and in death, she could never stop being examined, and autopsy photos analyzed, and timeline discrepancies parsed, and witness statements compared in an endless search for the truth that remained perpetually out of reach. The girl who had stared at the RKO water tower and dreamed of becoming a movie star had achieved something beyond stardom, and she had become a permanent American mystery, with her death as famous as her life, and her final hours as scrutinized as any role she had ever played. And the curtain had fallen, but the performance never ended. And the tile at the entrance to her Brentwood home bore a Latin inscription, Cursum Perficio, I am finishing my journey, a haunting reminder of what happened. And in the decades since that August night, armies of investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths have searched for answers in timeline discrepancies and missing phone records and contradictory statements of witnesses who changed their stories with the years. And they have found theories, but they have not found truth. And perhaps they were looking in the wrong place. But the mystery of how Marilyn Monroe died has eclipsed something more important, and that is how she lived. The unwanted child who became the most wanted woman in the world, the girl who educated herself through public libraries and sheer determination, and the actress who outmaneuvered studio executives and built her own production company when women were treated as decorative property, and the reader of Dostoevsky who let the world believe she was a dumb blonde because she understood how to weaponize underestimation. She contained multitudes and was reduced to a single image. The white dress, the subway grate, the performance of desirability that obscured the performer herself. But whatever happened on August 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe deserved better than she received. Better from her parents, her husbands, and her doctors. And better from a culture that consumed her image while dismissing her humanity. And she absolutely deserved to grow old. So remember the girl at the orphanage window, staring at the studio water tower and dreaming harder than anyone. Norma Jean Mortensen came into this world unwanted, and Marilyn Monroe left it alone. The journey is finished, but the questions remain. And that is that on the life and very mysterious, unfortunate, and untimely death of Marilyn Monroe. If you guys want me to deep dive into any other topics, let me know down below. I always read the comments, and until then, stay safe, and I'll see your beautiful face in the next one. All right? Bye. The coroner ruled it a homicide. The jury called it manslaughter, and his family called it murder.
First of all, Michael told me that they were going to murder him.
He was the most famous person alive, and he sold more records than anyone in history. And he owned a catalog worth billions, and he spent his final years telling everyone around him that someone was going to kill him for it. But nobody listened. And then in 2024, his name resurfaced in the Epstein files, and the whole world started asking questions again. But they were asking the wrong ones. This is the mysterious life and death of Michael Jackson. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Today, we are talking about one of the most famous human beings ever, and how he came to be that famous, and what happened because of it. And there's a lot of things in here I had no idea about, especially with all the Epstein stuff coming out and everything. It is going to be a jam-packed video. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam all the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this Michael Jackson life and death deep dive video together. So the story of Michael Jackson begins not with him, but with a place, and with the people that place made. Gary, Indiana was a company town in the most literal sense, founded in 1906 by the United States Steel Corporation and named for the chairman of its board, Albert Henry Gary. The city existed to feed the furnaces. Gary Works, stretching along the southern shore of Lake Michigan, would grow into the largest steel mill on Earth, and the jobs would draw tens of thousands of families northward during the Great Migration. And by 1960, the population would peak at around 178,000 people. And the air in this place just tasted like metal. And the work was dangerous, and the pay was steady, and the neighborhoods were segregated, and the churches were full on Sundays. And among those who came north was a man born into that migration's current, Joseph Walter Jackson, who arrived in the world on July 26, 1928, in Fountain Hill, a small community in Ashley County, Arkansas, and deep in that flat cotton country of the southeastern delta, barely a mile from the Louisiana line. And his father, Samuel Joseph Jackson, was a school teacher the locals would call Professor Jackson. And his mother was Crystal Lee King. So the family carried within it the tangled bloodlines of the American South. Joe's grandfather, Israel Nero Jackson, born in 1838, had been enslaved, and his great-grandfather, July Jack Gale, was said to have been a U.S. Army scout who claimed Native American heritage, though the specifics of that claim, sometimes identified as Choctaw, are difficult to verify through surviving records. So Joe moved to East Chicago, Indiana at 18, and he was a physically imposing man with large hands and a hard stare, and he found work in the way other African American men in the region found work, at the mills. And he would become an overhead crane operator at Inland Steel Company and later worked at American Foundries, also in East Chicago. And the hours working there were long, and the labor was grinding. And somewhere in the repetition of shifts and paychecks, Joe Jackson began to understand that he wanted something else, something that made noise, that moved a crowd, that refused to be ordinary. And the woman who would share that wanting and temper it with something quieter and more enduring had her own story of migration and survival. Katie B. Screws was born on May 4th, 1930 in Clayton, a town in Barber County, Alabama, the same red clay country that produced George Wallace. And at 2 years old, she would contract polio, and the disease would leave her with a permanent limp and a slight drag in her left leg that she would carry for the rest of her life. And when she was 4, the family would move north to East Chicago, joining the same stream of Southern African American families chasing the promise of the mills. But despite the polio, Katie, who would later go by Catherine, was deeply musical. She played piano, clarinet, and the cello, and she sang. And she absorbed the country gospel of her Alabama childhood and the rhythms of Indiana, and she would carry music inside her the way some people carry prayer. So Joe and Catherine met in 1947 in East Chicago, and she was 17 at the time, and he was already briefly married to a woman named Isaphine Atkinson, though that marriage was very short-lived. So Joe and Catherine married on November 5th, 1949, and in January 1950, they purchased a small house at 2300 Jackson Street in Gary for $8,500. Different times, I tell you what. And the house was around 672 square feet, with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and it sat on a modest lot in a working-class neighborhood, on the west side of Gary, close enough to the mill that you could hear the machinery if the wind was right. And into the house, over the next 16 years, Joe and Catherine Jackson would bring 10 children, a quantity of human life that the square footage could barely contain, stacked in bunk beds, sharing everything, privacy, a concept that existed only in theory. So in the early 1950s, Joe and his brother Luther formed a blues band called the Falcons, sometimes known as Ford Falcons. And Joe played guitar and Luther played saxophone. And they gigged around the region in the networks of industrial cities south of Chicago that included Gary, East Chicago, and Hammond, playing the kind of electric blues that poured out of every juke joint and house party in those neighborhoods. And they were pretty decent, but the Falcons would never land any record deal. And after a few years, the band dissolved and Joe put his guitar in the closet. But he did not put away the ambition, as we know. And he folded it up and stored it somewhere deeper, in a place where it would eventually be redirected with ferocious, sometimes brutal precision. And that was toward his children. Now, the children came in rapid succession, and each one entered a household that was growing louder, more crowded, and more volatile. Now, Maureen Rylette, or Rebby, was born first on May 29, 1950, and then Sigmund Esco, or Jackie, on May 4th, 1951, and then Toriano Adderall, or Tito, on October 15th, 1953, and then Jermaine on December 11th, 1954, and then LaToya Yvonne on May 29th, 1956, then Marlon David on March 12th, 1957, along with his twin brother, Brandon, who drew a single breath and died the next day, unfortunately, on March 13th, 1957. And the death of Brandon was not discussed in the Jackson household. It was absorbed into the silence that families built around their worst losses. Just a ghost twin whose absence Marlon could carry quietly for decades. And then, on August 29th, 1958, at St. Mary's Mercy Hospital in Gary, Michael Joseph Jackson was born. And he was the 8th child, the 7th living, technically, and he had arrived in a house that was already overflowing, with children, with noise, with Joe's thwarted ambitions and Catherine's quiet faith, and the ever-present economic pressure of a steel worker's wage stretched across a family that would eventually number 11. And 2 more children would follow, Stephen Randall, or Randy, on October 29th, 1961, and Janet Demita Joe on May 16th, 1966. And in 1963, Catherine would convert to the Jehovah's Witness faith and was baptized. And the religion would shape the Jackson household profoundly with its door-to-door evangelism and its prohibition on holidays and birthdays, its apocalyptic worldview, its emphasis on spiritual discipline. And it was Catherine's faith, not Joe's, and it would live inside Michael Jackson for the rest of his life, even as he struggled with it, even as he left and returned to it, and even as it complicated everything. Now, Joe Jackson was, by virtually every account, including those of his children, a strict and sometimes physically abusive father, because he demanded obedience and he demanded excellence. And when the guitar came back out of the closet, this time not for Joe's own playing, but for his son's, the discipline that governed the household became something closer to a regime. Now, the guitar was forbidden, and that was the rule. Joe kept it in the bedroom closet, a cheap electric model, nothing special, but it was his, a relic of the Falcons, and the dream that hadn't worked out. And the children were not to touch it, because Joe was at the mill during the day, and the children were not supervised every minute. And Tito, the third born, the quiet one, the one with the large hands like his father's, could not stay away from it. And he would wait until Joe left for his shift, then slide the closet door open and take out the guitar carefully, the way you would handle something you've been told to never handle. And he would teach himself to play by ear, picking out the songs he heard on the radio. The Temptations, the Four Tops, the electric blues his father used to play in the clubs. And he was getting pretty good. And then, one day in 1964, he broke a string. And the discovery could have gone badly, because in the Jackson household, disobedience was met with a belt, a switch, or a cord, whatever was in the closet. But something shifted in Joe when he heard Tito play. The boy had talent, real talent. And Joe Jackson, the man whose own band had never gotten a record deal, the crane operator who went to work every day in a city that was already beginning to die, recognized in his son's stolen guitar playing the second chance he had been waiting for. So, he didn't punish Tito, he bought him a guitar. And what followed was the formation of a family band with the discipline of a military unit and the ambition of a Fortune 500 company. And in 1964, Joe organized the Jackson brothers, Tito on guitar, Jackie and Jermaine on vocals, plus 2 neighborhood friends, Raynaud Jones and Milford Height, filling out the rhythm. And they rehearsed in the living room of 2300 Jackson Street in that 672 square foot house where the walls were thin enough to hear everything and the neighbors could hear them too. And Joe ran rehearsals the way he ran everything, with absolute authority. Guy was a tyrant. And mistakes were not tolerated, and repetition was the method. Fear was the motivator. And by August 1965, 2 more Jackson brothers had joined the group. Marlon, who was 8, and Michael, who was only 6 years old. And the neighborhood friends would slowly be eased out, because this was now all a Jackson operation. And at a performance at Gary's Tino Tots Jamboree, a woman named Evelyn LaHaye suggested the group needed a proper name. And someone, accounts vary on exactly who, proposed the Jackson 5. And the name stuck. And Michael, at 6 years old, was not yet the lead singer, though. That role belonged to Jermaine, who had a smooth, reliable tenor. And Michael sang backup and danced. But even in those earliest performances, talent shows at elementary schools, community centers, local clubs where children probably shouldn't have been, something was visibly different about the youngest performer on stage. He moved with an intuition that couldn't be taught. He watched James Brown on television with the focus of a graduate student, absorbing every spin, every split, every way Brown used his body to make the crowd lose its utter mind. And he studied Jackie Wilson, and he studied the Temptations choreography, and then he did it better than any child had a right to. And in 1966, the Jackson 5 won their first talent show at Theodore Roosevelt High School in Gary, and it was the beginning of a streak. And Joe entered them into every competition he could find, driving them across Indiana. The family packed into a Volkswagen van that barely held them all, and they won. And they kept winning, and Joe booked them into rougher venues, bars, strip clubs, places where a group of children performed between adult acts, and the audience threw money if they were good and bottles if they weren't. Just sketchy as places where kids should not be. And Michael later described watching striptease acts as a small child, standing in the wings waiting for the Jackson 5's turn, and he was now 9 years old. And by mid-1967, a shift had taken place within the group that everyone could hear Michael's voice. Still a child's voice, still high and clear, had developed a quality that Jermaine simply didn't possess. And it wasn't just range or pitch, it was just emotion, an almost unsettling ability to inhabit a lyric's feeling and project it outward with adult conviction. So Joe made a decision. Michael replaced Jermaine as lead singer, or Jermaine. Damn! So the group's center of gravity moved permanently to the youngest brother on stage. And on August 13th, 1967, they won amateur night at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, the most famous proving ground of African-American entertainment, and the stage where Ella Fitzgerald and James Brown and Stevie Wonder had been discovered, where the audience was legendarily unforgiving and the hook was not a metaphor. And at this point, Michael was 8 years old, and the Apollo audience gave them a standing ovation. So the question of who discovered the Jackson 5 is one of the foundational myths of the Motown era, and like most myths, it obscures a messier truth. The official story is the one that Berry Gordy wanted told, the one printed on the debut album cover, which was that Diana Ross discovered the Jackson 5. But it was just a marketing masterstroke, the biggest female star in black music presenting the next generation, a laying on of hands from Motown royalty to Motown future. And the first Jackson 5 album was titled Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5. And Ross appeared at their early press events, and the implication was clear and very deliberate. And it was also largely fiction. Which at this point, I mean, it started back then, you know? All this stuff, like I went over Taylor Swift and how her whole life was manufactured. It's interesting looking at the parallels and just, I've only gone into two major artists now, but the parallels are crazy, how much they're manufactured and how much smoke and mirrors there are in the entertainment industry. But the true discoverer was Bobby Taylor, a singer and band leader from Motown's second tier who fronted Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers. Because Taylor saw the Jackson 5 perform at the Regal Theater in Chicago, the South Side equivalent of the Apollo, and was stunned. And he brought them to Motown's attention, arranged their audition, and produced their early recordings. And Gladys Knight also deserves a footnote in the discovery narrative, because she saw the Jackson 5 at the Regal in 1967 as well, and was so impressed that she sent a demo tape to Motown on their behalf, but the tape was rejected. And the irony is almost too good, because one of Motown's biggest stars recommending a group that would become Motown's biggest act was being ignored. But the formal audition took place on July 23rd, 1968 at Hitsville, USA, Motown's legendary headquarters on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, the converted house with a hand-painted sign that had produced more #1 hits than any address in America. And the Jackson brothers performed in the studio, and Berry Gordy, contrary to what some accounts have suggested, was not present for the audition, and he saw a tape of it later. But the Motown staff who were in the room that day knew immediately what they were looking at. Michael, now 9 years old, performed with a precision and emotional range that was difficult to reconcile with his age. And he sang like a man who had been heartbroken, and he had never been on a date at this point, obviously because he's 9. and Motown signed the Jackson 5, and the machine began to turn. So in mid-August 1969, Joe moved the boys to California, and Catherine and the rest of the children didn't join until November. And for the Jackson brothers from Gary, Indiana, from the 672 square foot house on Jackson Street, from the steel smoke air and the frozen winters and the talent shows at Theodore Roosevelt High, Los Angeles was another planet. The light was different, the air smelled like jasmine instead of sulfur, and the houses had swimming pools. And on October 1st, 1969, Michael, now 11 years old, moved temporarily into the Hollywood Hills home of Diana Ross, and he lived with her for about a month while the family's permanent arrangements were being finalized. And Ross became a kind of surrogate older sister and glamorous mentor to Michael. And Michael absorbed her elegance, her poise, her understanding of how a star just occupied space. And he watched her the way he watched everything, just silently, totally storing it all for later use. And then Motown released the single. And the velocity of what happened next has no real parallel in the history of popular music. Because on October 7th, 1969, less than 2 months after the family arrived in California, Motown released I Want You Back, the Jackson 5's debut single. And the song was a masterpiece of pure pop construction. A bouncing bass line, a staccato piano chords, a horn section that punched like a fist, and riding above all of it was the voice of an 11-year-old boy singing about romantic heartbreak with conviction that made you forget he was 11. Because the vocal performance was technically extraordinary, with the phrasing, the breath control, the way Michael bent notes and slid between registers. But what made it transcendent was something harder to name. There was joy in it. There was urgency. There was a child's voice carrying an adult's emotion within it, without any question. And the effect was just electrifying. And I Want You Back reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on January 31st, 1970. And Michael Jackson was 11 years old, making him the youngest artist to ever top the chart. And the record sold over 2 million copies in its first 6 weeks. And what followed was just unprecedented. And the Jackson 5 became the first recording act in history to debut with 4 consecutive #1 singles. Not the first group, not the first family act, but the first act of any kind. And the streak unfolded with the mechanical precision of a Motown hit factory operating at peak efficiency. And I Want You Back, #1, January 31st, 1970. ABC, #1, April 25th, 1970. The song knocked the Beatles' Let It Be out of the top spot, which is crazy. It was just a symbolic passing of the generational torch that the music press seized upon with just utter glee. And then the Love You Save, #1, June 27th, 1970, and I'll Be There, which was #1, October 17th, 1970. And this one was a ballad, the one that proved the Jackson 5 were not merely a novelty act built on energy and choreography. I'll Be There was tender and restrained and just very sincere. And Michael sang it as though comforting someone through a crisis. And the performance was so emotionally mature that it unsettled people even. Because where the hell did a child learn to just feel like that? How did a boy from a 2-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana develop the capacity to communicate grief and reassurance with the authority of someone who had already lived in a full life? And nobody had an answer. And the song became the Jackson 5's biggest selling single, moving over 4 million copies. 4 singles, 4 #1s, 9 months. The group had arrived in California as unknowns and became, by the end of 1970, the biggest act in popular music. So the fame was crazy. And by 1971, the Jackson 5 had their own Saturday morning cartoon, Jackson 5 with the 5 instead of the F, which aired on ABC from 1971 to 1972, rendering the brothers as animated characters in weekly adventures. And they were on lunchboxes and bedroom posters and magazine covers. And teenage girls screamed at their concerts that drew comparisons to Beatlemania. And the Jackson 5 were selling arenas across the country. And at the center of every performance, drawing every eye, generating every gasp, was Michael. And that very year, the family purchased the Havenhurst estate, a sprawling compound on a tree-lined street in Encino in the San Fernando Valley, for approximately $250,000. And the Jackson 5 had crossed this line in less than 5 years. And Michael, at this point, was 12 years old. And he was the most famous child in America by far. And the machine was just getting started. As Michael Jackson's solo recording career began while he was still a child inside of this machine. And in June 1971, at 12 years old, he entered Motown's studio without his brothers for the first time. And his debut solo single, Got to Be There, was released that October. A gentle, yearning love song that proved his voice could carry a record on its own. And the following year, Ben, a ballad sung to a rat from the horror film of the same name, became his first #1 pop solo single, and he was 13 at that point. And he had a #1 hit and a Saturday morning cartoon and a family act that was still selling out arenas, and none of it was enough. Not for Joe, and not for Michael either, and increasingly not for the brothers, who were growing restless under Motown's ironclad creative control. And the break came in 1975, though, and the Jacksons signed a contract with CBS Records' Epic label in June, leaving Motown behind. And the reasons were partly financial, because Motown had been paying a royalty rate of 2.7%, a figure that bordered on exploitative even by the standards of the era, while Epic offered dramatically more. But the deeper issue was creative freedom. And at Motown, the Jackson 5 recorded songs chosen for them, produced by staff producers with virtually no input into their own material. And Epic would promise them the right to write and produce. But there was a cost. Motown retained ownership of the name Jackson 5, forcing the group to rebrand as the Jacksons. And Jermaine, married to Berry Gordy's daughter Hazel, stayed behind at Motown, a choice that fractured something in the family they never fully healed from. So the moment Michael Jackson stopped being a former child star and became something unprecedented arrived through a movie musical nobody expected to matter. And in 1977, Jackson was cast as the Scarecrow in The Wiz, an all-African-American reimagining of The Wizard of Oz, starring Diana Ross. And the film itself was a commercial disappointment, actually. But on set, Jackson met Quincy Jones, the legendary producer and arranger who was serving as the film's musical supervisor and producer. Now, Jones was 54, a veteran of Count Basie's orchestra and Frank Sinatra's recording sessions, a man who had worked at the highest levels of jazz, pop, film, scoring, and R&B for 3 decades. A big deal, all right? And he heard something in the now 19-year-old Michael Jackson that went beyond talent. A perfectionism, an obsessive work ethic, a willingness to be pushed, probably from his father. And Jackson asked Jones to produce his next solo album, and Jones agreed. So they recorded from December 1978 through June 1979, and Off the Wall was released on August 10th, 1979, and it was a revelation, if you know anything about Michael Jackson. The future album just fused disco, funk, pop, and R&B into something seamlessly sophisticated. Just adult music made by a 20-year-old who sang with the authority of someone twice his age, just like when he was a kid. He just had this maturity about himself and his voice that was just unprecedented. And Don't Stop Till You Get Enough and Rock... It's hard not to sing these titles. So Don't Stop Till You Get Enough and Rock With You both reached #1. And the album sold over 20 million copies worldwide, and it won the Grammy for Best R&B Vocal Performance for Males. But it did not win Album of the Year, somehow. And that loss stung Michael Jackson in a way that people around him recognized as something more than disappointment. It was just fuel for him, because he had made one of the best-selling albums in history, and the Recording Academy had just looked past it. And he told people close to him that the next album would be so big they couldn't ignore it, and he meant it. And what he made next was the best-selling album in the history of recorded music. Thriller was recorded between April 14th and November 8th of 1982 at Westlake Recording Studios in Los Angeles, with Quincy Jones again producing. And the budget was $750,000, expensive for the era, but modest for what it became. And Jackson wrote 4 of the 9 tracks: Wanna Be Startin' Something, The Girl Is Mine, Beat It, and Billie Jean. Just masterpieces of music. Oh my God. And the album was released on November 29th, 1982. And the numbers that followed defied any simple comprehension because Thriller spent 37 non-consecutive weeks at number 1 on the Billboard 200. It was the best-selling album of 1983. It was the best-selling album of 1984. And all 7 of its singles reached the top 10. Billie Jean held the number 1 spot for 7 weeks and Beat It, which featured a guitar solo by Eddie Van Halen, who's one of my favorite guitarists ever, held it for 3. And estimated total sales have reached 70 million copies worldwide, a figure no other album has even approached. And I'm talking about one album specifically. Don't come in my comments and be like, oh, what about the Beatles or Taylor Swift? No, okay? This is the top-selling album of all time, all right? But the cultural machinery around Thriller was as revolutionary as the music itself. And when MTV, still in its infancy and programming almost exclusively white rock acts, initially declined to air the Billie Jean video, and CB Records president Walter Yetnikoff reportedly threatened to pull all CBS content from the network, and MTV relented. In the video, Jackson, in a pink shirt and white sequin socks, dancing under streetlights on a sidewalk whose tiles illuminated beneath his feet, became the network's most requested clip and effectively integrated MTV. And the 13-minute Thriller short film, directed by John Landis and budgeted between $500,000 and $900,000, functioned less as a music video than a miniature horror movie. I remember the first time I watched it, my mind was blown, to say the least. But it was so elaborate that Michael Jackson, a practicing Jehovah's Witness troubled by the occult imagery, ordered the negatives destroyed before his attorney, John Branca, convinced him to simply add a disclaimer. And in 2009, it became the first music video inducted into the National Film Registry. And on February 28, 1984, Thriller won 8 Grammy Awards, a record at the time. But the image that sealed Thriller's mythology in the public consciousness had come 10 months earlier on a television stage. Because on May 16, 1983, NBC broadcast Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a reunion special celebrating Motown Records' 25th anniversary. And approximately 47 million people watched, which is a lot. And Jackson performed Billie Jean, and during the performance, in a moment that he had rehearsed privately for weeks after learning the move from a dancer named Garen Katzper Candidate in June 1981, he executed the moonwalk for the first time on live television. Iconic! And the other performers backstage watched the monitors in silence. And Fred Astaire called Jackson the next morning, and in a single fluid backward glide, 6 seconds, maybe 7, Michael Jackson passed from stardom into something that had no adequate name. And less than a year after the Motown 25 performance on January 27, 1984, Michael Jackson was filming a Pepsi commercial at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. And on the 6th take, pyrotechnics ignited too close to his head, and his hair caught fire. And he suffered second-degree burns to his scalp, and crew members rushed to extinguish the flames, and Jackson was taken to hospital, where he was treated and released. And Pepsi settled the resulting claim, and Jackson donated $1.5 million of the settlement to the Bronfman Medical Center, which renamed its burn center in his honor. Just like so sweet. And in his autopsy, decades later, would reveal that Jackson was almost completely bald beneath the wigs he wore for the rest of his life from that. But the deeper wound was pharmaceutical. To manage the pain from the burn and subsequent reconstructive procedures, Jackson was prescribed opioid painkillers. And nearly every person close to him would later identify the Pepsi burn as the starting point of the prescription drug dependency that shadowed the rest of his life and ultimately contributed to his untimely death. But the third and final collaboration between Jackson and Quincy Jones was Bad, recorded from 1985 to 1987 and released on August 31st, 1987. And Michael Jackson wrote 9 of the album's 11 tracks, a dramatic increase in creative control from Thriller, and the album sold 2.25 million copies in its first week and generated a record 5 consecutive #1 singles from a single album. And the title track's music video was directed by Martin Scorsese and featured a young Wesley Snipes. And total sales exceeded 35 million copies worldwide. And the Bad World Tour, September 12th, 1987 through January 27th, 1989, was 123 concerts across 15 countries, grossing $125 million. And Diana, Princess of Wales, attended the July 16th, 1988 show at the Wembley Stadium. And Bad was, by an objective measure, one of the most successful albums ever released. And it was also the first time Jackson encountered the peculiar burden of his own success. Because Bad was treated in certain critical quarters as a disappointment, not because it failed by any measure, but because it was not Thriller. Because nothing could be. The standard he had set was inhuman, and it would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his career. So in 1985, between the triumph of Thriller and the recording of Bad, Michael Jackson made the business decision that would define his financial life, and some believe his death. Paul McCartney, during their collaborations on The Girl Is Mine and Say, 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 had explained to Jackson how music publishing worked, that owning the rights to songs was where the real money lived, not performing or recording them. And Michael listened carefully. And when the ATV music publishing catalog came up for sale, a portfolio of roughly 4,000 songs, including 251 compositions by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Jackson pursued it aggressively. And the purchase closed on approximately August 10th, 1985 for $47.5 million. And Michael Jackson now owned Yesterday, Hey Jude, and Let It Be, and dozens of other songs that formed the bedrock of 20th century popular music. And McCartney, who wanted the catalog himself, was reportedly furious. And the friendship never recovered. And the catalog would appreciate enormously over the following decades, and in 1995, Michael Jackson merged his holdings with Sony Music's publishing division to create Sony ATV Music Publishing, a joint venture in which he retained a 50% stake. So by the time of his death, the catalog was valued at approximately $1 billion. And by 2016, when Sony purchased the estate's share for $750 million, estimates had climbed to $4 billion. So the catalog made Michael Jackson extraordinarily wealthy on paper, so it also made him a target. And he would spend the last years of his life telling people that someone was going to kill him for it. So after Bad, Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones parted ways professionally. And for Dangerous, released in 1991, Jackson turned to Teddy Riley, the pioneer of New Jack Swing, and the album's sound reflected the shift. Harder, more rhythmically aggressive, and more experimental. And it was Jackson's first album without Jones since Forever Michael in 1975. And it sold 32 million copies worldwide. And on January 31st, 1993, Jackson headlined the halftime show at the Super Bowl in Pasadena. And it was the first major music superstar to do so. And it's iconic. I mean, he's just like standing on stage and just the crowd screaming, and he's just sitting there just soaking it in. It's the best Super Bowl, in my opinion, right next to Prince. And the performance was a spectacle of unprecedented scale. Like I said, when Jackson stood motionless on stage for 90 seconds while the crowd roared, then launched into a medley that included Jam, Billie Jean, and Heal the World, it was the first Super Bowl halftime where ratings increased between halves, a phenomenon that transformed the halftime show from a bathroom break afterthought into the premier live performance slot in American entertainment. And every halftime spectacle since, Prince, Beyonce, Shakira, which are also amazing shows, exists in the template Jackson created that afternoon. And History, Past, Present, and Future, Book 1, released in 1995, was a double album, one disc of greatest hits, one of new material. And it contained You Are Not Alone, which became the first song in Billboard history to debut at number 1 on the Hot 100. And the History World Tour that followed him from 1996 to 1997 covered 82 concerts across 35 countries and grossed $165 million, the highest grossing solo tour of the 90s. And by the mid-90s, Michael Jackson had sold more records than any solo artist in history. And he had invented the modern music video, and he had integrated MTV, and he had transformed the Super Bowl halftime show. He owned the most valuable music publishing catalog on Earth, and he was, by virtually any metric, the most famous human being alive. And then everything began to fall apart, because behind the stage lights and the record sales and the increasingly surreal scale of the fame, there was a person. And that person was unwell in ways the public was only beginning to understand, and lonely in ways the public could not have imagined. And the health problems came first, and they came early. So in 1983, going back a little bit in time, Dr. Arnold Klein, a Beverly Hills dermatologist who would become one of the most consequential and controversial figures in Jackson's life, diagnosed him with discoid lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune condition affecting the skin. And 3 years later, in 1986, Klein delivered a second diagnosis, vitiligo, a condition in which the immune system attacks the melanocytes that produce skin pigment, creating irregular patches of depigmentation across the body. And for any person, vitiligo is a difficult diagnosis. But for a black man who was the most photographed human being on the planet, a man whose changing appearance was already the subject of relentless tabloid speculation, it was catastrophic. And Jackson would not publicly disclose the vitiligo until February 10th, 1993, in a live interview with Oprah Winfrey, watched by 90 million people. And by then, years of tabloid cruelty had calcified a narrative that Jackson was bleaching his skin out of self-hatred or racial confusion. But the truth was a medical condition he had not chosen and could not control. And his autopsy 16 years later would confirm the diagnosis definitively, documenting focal depigmentation across 5 areas of his body. And then came the Pepsi burn in January 1984, which we talked about previously, and with it, the opioid prescriptions that introduced Jackson to a pharmaceutical world he would never fully leave. And in 1993, after the crisis that would engulf him that year, Elizabeth Taylor personally led an intervention. And Jackson entered rehab at a facility in London and completed a 12-step program, and the dependency retreated but did not disappear. It would return in different forms with different substances across different doctors for the rest of his life. And the most dangerous of those substances was propofol, a powerful intravenous anesthetic used in hospitals to induce unconsciousness for surgery. And Jackson began using propofol during the History World Tour in 1996 to 1997. Administered by anesthesiologists he hired to travel with him, and he used it to sleep. For a man suffering from chronic and debilitating insomnia, a condition that worsened with every passing year, propofol offered the only reliable path to unconsciousness. But it was not sleep in any medical sense. It suppressed REM cycles entirely, offering oblivion without rest. And an expert who testified in 2013 estimated that Jackson may have gone 60 days without REM sleep before his death, which is catastrophic. So his brain, by the end, was being deprived of the very thing sleep is supposed to provide. And if Jackson's health was quietly deteriorating through the 1980s and 1990s, his personal world was also taking shape in ways the public found endlessly fascinating and largely incomprehensible. Because the friendships came first, and the most important of them was Elizabeth Taylor. They met in the mid-1980s, likely at a Victoria Tour concert at Dodger Stadium in late 1984. And the connection was immediate and deep. Two people who had been child stars, who had grown up inside fame's distortion field, who understood what it cost to be watched by millions before you understood who you even were. And Taylor became Jackson's fiercest defender and closest confidant. And on April 12, 1989, at the Soul Train Awards, she introduced him with the title that would follow him permanently, the King of Pop. And on October 6, 1991, Michael Jackson hosted her 8th wedding to Larry Fortensky at Neverland Ranch. And their friendship lasted over 25 years until Taylor's death in 2011. And she was, by many accounts, one of the very few people on Earth who could speak to Michael Jackson honestly and be heard. And his meeting with Princess Diana was briefer, but no less meaningful to him. Because on July 16th, 1988, like we said before, Diana attended his Bad World Tour show at Wembley Stadium. And Jackson had removed Dirty Diana from the set list out of concern that the title might embarrass her. And Diana, learning of this, reportedly requested that he perform it, and he did. And they met only that once in person backstage at Wembley. And when Diana was killed in a car crash on August 31st, 1997, Jackson was so shaken that he postponed his scheduled performance in Austin, Belgium, moving it from August 31st to September 3rd. And if you want to know more about Diana's death, I will link that video that I covered her whole life and mysterious death down below. And in 1988, Jackson purchased the property that would become the physical manifestation of his inner world. Neverland Valley Ranch sat on approximately 2,700 acres in the Santa Ynez Valley near Los Olivos, California, with rolling golden hills studded with oak trees, an hour and a half northeast of Los Angeles. And the purchase price was somewhere between $17 and $19.5 million, depending on the source. Now, the main residence was roughly 12,600 square feet, but the house was almost beside the point, because what Jackson built around it was something between a private theme park and a living fairy tale. A Ferris wheel, a carousel, a miniature railroad, a zoo with giraffes and elephants and chimpanzees, a movie theater, gardens, just anything and everything, you name it, that you would have wanted to see as a kid, it was there. And he named it after the island in Peter Pan where children never grow up. And the symbolism was not subtle, as Jackson identified with Peter Pan openly and repeatedly throughout his life.
He said to me that he's Peter Pan, and I feel that way too, and I guess we have the same feel about life.
Because he saw childhood as something sacred and something that had been stolen from him. And Neverland became Jackson's refuge, his creative workspace, and eventually the setting of the accusations that nearly destroyed him. Because he would live there on and off for nearly 2 decades before the property became too painful to inhabit. And it would be sold in December of 2020, more than 11 years after his death, for $22 million. Now, the romantic relationships were few, intense, and brief. And Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley first crossed paths as children, backstage at a Las Vegas concert in approximately 1974 or 1975. When she was about 7 and he was about 17. And her father was Elvis Presley, as we know, and his father was Joe Jackson. So they were, in a sense, the only 2 people on Earth who could fully understand each other's childhoods. And they would reconnect as adults in November 1992 when Jackson was in the earliest stages of his personal crisis that would soon become public. And their conversations grew frequent and intimate. And on May 26, 1994, 20 days after her divorce from musician Danny Q was finalized, they married in a private ceremony in the Dominican Republic. And the world reacted with almost uniform disbelief. The tabloids treated the marriage as a publicity stunt, a strategic alliance between 2 famous names designed to rehabilitate Jackson's image during the fallout from the 1993 allegations. And on September 8th, 1994, at the MTV Video Music Awards, Jackson and Presley appeared on stage together, and he leaned over and kissed her. And the audience didn't know whether to cheer or cringe. And it remains one of the most analyzed public kisses in entertainment history. But whatever the marriage was, and Presley would later insist, credibly and emotionally, that it was real, it did not last. And they separated on December 10th, 1995. And Presley filed for divorce on January 18th, 1996, and it was finalized on August 20th, 1996. And in all her later accounts of the relationship, Presley described Jackson as deeply loving, but also deeply troubled, consumed by prescription drugs, and surrounded by enablers she couldn't penetrate. And she told Oprah Winfrey in 2010 that in one of their final conversations in 2005, Jackson had told her that someone was going to kill him for his music catalog. And she confirmed he gave her specific names, and she declined to share them for whatever reason. And the second marriage was different in almost every way, as Debbie Rowe was a nurse in Dr. Arnold Klein's dermatology office. And she and Jackson had known each other for years through Klein's practice, and on November 14th, 1996, less than 3 months after the Presley divorce was finalized, Jackson and Rowe married in Sydney, Australia. And she was 6 months pregnant, and their first child, Michael Joseph Jackson Jr., called Prince, was born on February 13th, 1997. And their second, Paris Michael Catherine Jackson, was born on April 3rd, 1998. And the marriage appeared from outside and arguably from the inside to be primarily an arrangement for producing children. And Rowe would later describe the relationship in transactional terms, saying she had agreed to bear Jackson's children because she saw how much he wanted to be a father. But they would divorce in approximately April of 2000, with Rowe receiving an $8 million settlement and initially relinquishing custody. And Jackson's third child, Prince Michael Jackson II, originally called Blanket, later Biggie, was born on February 21st, 2002 via surrogate. And the identity of the surrogate and the biological mother has never been publicly confirmed. And on November 19th, 2002, Jackson committed the single most damaging public relations act of his career that didn't involve a courtroom. Standing on the balcony of his suite at the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, he dangled the infant Blanket over the railing, 4 stories above the street, while a crowd below screamed and cameras flashed. And the image circled the globe within hours, and Jackson later called it a terrible mistake, and obviously it was. But it was also a window into something the public was only beginning to reckon with. That the most famous man in the world was not functioning normally, that his judgment was eroding, and that whatever private reality he inhibited was drifting further and further from the one the rest of the world shared. So by the early 2000s, Michael Jackson was a father of 3, a 2-time divorcee, the owner of the most valuable music catalog in the world, and a man whose body was quietly failing, ravaged by vitiligo, lupus, surgical procedures, chronic insomnia, and a pharmaceutical dependency that no intervention had permanently resolved. And he was 44 years old. And he was still, by any measure, the most famous person alive. And the worst was yet to come. So in May of 1992, a woman named June Chandler and her 13-year-old son Jordan were stranded on the side of the road in Los Angeles. Their car had broken down and they'd called Rent-A-Wreck for a replacement. And when it arrived, the employee who helped them recognized a name on the paperwork. One of their contacts was someone who worked with Michael Jackson. And throughout that thin thread of connection, June Chandler mentioned the encounter to the right person, who mentioned it to someone else, and within weeks, the Chandler family had entered Michael Jackson's orbit. Now, Jackson took to Jordan, or Jordy, as the family called him, with an intensity that was, by then, recognizable to people around him. And he had a pattern of forming deeply close relationships with children, particularly boys around the age of 12 or 13. And he would call them constantly, invite them to Neverland, shower them and their families with gifts and access to his world. And he was generous to a degree that seemed almost compulsive. And to Jackson, these relationships were innocent, an attempt to experience the childhood he believed had been stolen from him, to live inside the uncomplicated joy of a child's companionship. But to observers, they were at best unusual and at worst alarming. And the distance between those two interpretations would define the rest of Jackson's life. Now, Jordan Chandler's father was Evan Chandler, a Beverly Hills dentist who also worked as a screenwriter with a co-writing credit on Mel Brooks' Robin Hood, Men in Tights. And Evan was not part of the initial connection, because June had primary custody, and it was through her that Jackson and Jordan spent increasing amounts of time together. But Evan Chandler grew suspicious of the relationship, then angry, then something harder to categorize. So on July 8th, 1993, Evan Chandler was recorded in a phone conversation saying, quote,
"If I go through with this, I win big time. I will get everything I want, and they will be destroyed forever."
And the statement would become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the case, because to Jackson defenders, it was proof that the allegations were financially motivated from the start, a shakedown dressed as child protection. And to those who believed the accusations, it was a father's anguished calculation about the legal system's leverage, not evidence that the underlying claims were false. Both readings are sustainable, but neither are definitive. And on August 17th, 1993, the allegations were formally reported to authorities, and Jordan Chandler described acts of SA by Jackson. And the Los Angeles Police Department and the Department of Children and Family Services opened investigations. And the story detonated across the global media with a force that made every previous Jackson tabloid saga look quaint. And on December 20th, 1993, Jackson submitted a strip search, a body examination conducted by investigators seeking to determine whether Jordan Chandler's description of Jackson's anatomy matched reality. And Jackson described the experience as the most humiliating event of his life. And the results of the examination have been the subject of conflicting interpretations ever since. because Jackson's camp maintained the descriptions did not match, and the prosecution's position was more ambiguous. And 2 grand juries were convened, and one in Los Angeles, one in Santa Barbara. Over 13 months, more than 400 witnesses were interviewed, and neither grand jury returned an indictment. So without an indictment, there could be no criminal trial, and on January 25th, 1994, a civil settlement was reached. And the amount was approximately $23 million, and Jackson's insurance carrier paid the claim. And Jackson's legal team maintained, and Jackson himself would insist for the rest of his life, that the settlement was not an admission of guilt, but a strategic decision to end a situation that was destroying him personally and professionally at the recommendation of his attorneys and over his own objections. And his critics argued that innocent men don't pay $23 million. And his defenders countered that innocent men, who are the most famous person on earth and hemorrhaging millions of dollars per week in canceled deals and destroyed partnerships, sometimes do. And the settlement did not include a confidentiality clause preventing the Chandlers from cooperating with criminal authorities. And Jordan Chandler and his family chose not to pursue criminal charges, so the investigation was closed. And Evan Chandler died on November 5th, 2009, less than 5 months after Michael Jackson's death. That is a bit suspicious. Why would you do that? Seems like out of guilt, but what do I know? And at that point, he had been estranged from his son Jordan for years, and his death was reported quietly, a footnote in a larger story that had already moved on. So for nearly a decade after the settlement, Jackson lived under a cloud that never fully dissipated. And the allegations had not been proven, they had not been disproven either, and they existed in a permanent state of suspicion, following him into every room, coloring every interaction, inflecting every headline. And his record sales would decline, and his public image curdled, and the jokes became cruel and ubiquitous. And he retreated further into Neverland, further into isolation, and further into the company of children and the animals and amusement park rides that constituted his version of a normal life. And then, in February of 2003, a British journalist named Martin Bashir aired a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson. And Bashir had spent 8 months with Jackson, gaining extraordinary access to his daily life at Neverland. And the documentary included a scene in which Jackson held hands with a 13-year-old boy named Gavin Arvizo, a child cancer patient Jackson had befriended in 2000, and said, on camera,
"But is it really appropriate for a 44-year-old man to share a bedroom with a child who is not related to him at all?
That's a beautiful thing.
That's not a worrying thing?
Why should it be worrying?"
And he meant it innocently, but unfortunately, it did not land innocently. And the documentary was watched by an estimated 14.6 million viewers in the UK and 22 million in the US, and the reaction was immediate and devastating. And Gavin Arvizo's family subsequently alleged that Jackson had molested the boy. So on November 18th, 2003, approximately 70 sheriff's deputies raided Neverland Ranch. And 2 days later, on November 20th, Jackson turned himself in to Santa Barbara County authorities, and he was arrested, handcuffed, photographed, and released on $3 million bail. And the booking photo, his expression, somewhere between defiance and dissociation, was broadcast on every television screen in the world. And he later said the arrest was deliberately humiliating, that he was handcuffed so tightly his wrists bled, that he was locked in a restroom smeared with feces, and that the officers laughed. And Santa Barbara authorities denied the claims fully. The truth of what happened in those hours between surrender and release has never been independently established, but the charges were severe. And in December of 2003, the initial indictment included 7 counts of child molestation, 2 counts of administering an intoxicating agent to a minor, and 1 count of conspiracy. But by April 2004, the indictment had been restructured. 4 counts of minor, 4 counts of intoxicating a minor with alcohol, and 1 count of attempted and 1 count of conspiracy, and 10 charges that would expand to 14 at verdict when lesser included offenses were added. So if convicted on all counts, Jackson faced decades in prison. So the trial, People versus Jackson, began with jury selection on January 31st, 2005 in Santa Maria, California, before Judge Rodney Melville. And opening arguments commenced on February 28th, and the prosecution, led by District Attorney Tom Sneddon, who had investigated Jackson during the 1993 case as well, and whose pursuit of Jackson struck many observers as personal. And he presented its case over several months. And approximately 140 witnesses were called, and the defense dismantled the prosecution's case methodically, with Gavin Arvizo's mother, Janet, was shown to have a history of making false claims, including welfare fraud and a prior false accusation of S against a JCPenney security guard. And the timeline of the alleged abuse was problematic, and the prosecution claimed this abuse occurred after the Bashir documentary aired, meaning Jackson had supposedly chosen to abuse the child immediately after the entire world had been put on alert about his relationships with children. And the family had continued to voluntarily visit Neverland and accept Jackson's hospitality throughout the period in question, which was odd. And Macaulay Culkin, the former child star of Home Alone, who had been one of Jackson's closest childhood companions and who the prosecution hoped to establish as a prior victim, took the stand and testified unequivocally that he had never been abused by Jackson. And Wade Robson, an Australian choreographer who had known Jackson since childhood, also testified that he had never been abused. But Robson would reverse his position in 2013, filing a civil claim alleging years of abuse. But on the witness stand in 2005, under oath, he said it never happened. And on June 13th, 2005, the jury returned its verdict, not guilty, on all 14 counts, and it was unanimous. And Jackson was in the courtroom when the verdicts were read, and he showed little visible emotion. And outside the courthouse, thousands of fans who had maintained a vigil throughout the trial erupted. And inside, according to people who were with him, Jackson was hollowed out. And the acquittal was total, the vindication was complete, but it didn't matter. The trial had consumed nearly 2 years of his life, cost tens of millions of dollars, and left him physically and psychologically destroyed. And he had entered the courtroom weighing, by some accounts, less than 120 pounds because he had been unable to eat. And he had been unable to sleep, or rather, he had been unable to sleep without propofol, and the demands of daily court appearances had disrupted even that pharmaceutical oblivion. So after the verdict, Michael Jackson left the courthouse, left Santa Maria, and effectively left the United States. And he would spend most of the next 2.5 years abroad, in Bahrain, in Ireland, in various rented properties scattered across the world. A man acquitted of everything and unable to return to normal life. And Neverland, the place he had built as a sanctuary, had been raided and violated and publicized in every tabloid on Earth. So he felt like he couldn't go back, and he would never live there again. And the allegations from 1993 and 2005, the settlement and the acquittal, became the defining lens through which Michael Jackson would be viewed for the rest of his life and beyond. Not the music, not the dancing, not the record sales or the moonwalk or the transformation of pop culture. The question, the unresolvable, unanswerable, permanent question that followed him out of the courtroom, across the ocean, into exile, and it was still following him 3.5 years later, in the summer of 2009, when he agreed to perform 50 concerts in London and began rehearsing for a comeback he would not survive. So after the acquittal, Michael Jackson did what any person might do if they had been publicly accused of the worst crimes imaginable, dragged through a 5-month trial, broadcast to the world, and found not guilty on every count. He ran. And in June 2005, Jackson left the United States for Bahrain, a small island kingdom in the Persian Gulf, the personal guest of Sheikh Abdullah bin Hamad bin Aya Al Khalifa, a son of the king. That was a mouthful. And the Sheikh provided Jackson with a residence, staff, security, and a loan of $2.2 million to cover outstanding legal fees from the trial. And the arrangement was, for a time, a genuine refuge, and he stayed nearly a year from June 2005 to May 2006, before the relationship with the Sheikh kind of soured. And Abdullah later sued Jackson for approximately $4.7 million, claiming Jackson had failed to honor commitments related to a planned album and autobiography. And after Bahrain, Jackson drifted to Ireland for several months, then to various rented properties in the United States and Europe. But he was a man without a fixed address, without a clear plan, and without financial stability. And by this point, Jackson's debt had reached approximately $500 million. That number is almost incomprehensible until you understand its architecture. Because decades of lavish spending on Neverland's upkeep, the zoo, the staff, the constant travel, the legal defense costs from 2 sets of allegations, the entourage, the mansions, the shopping, all layered on top of hundreds of millions borrowed against his share of the Sony ATV catalog at punishing interest rates. He was one of the wealthiest people alive on paper and functionally insolvent in practice. And the catalog, worth billions, was also his only lifeline, the collateral that kept the creditors at bay. And if the loans defaulted, he could lose everything. So it was into this desperation that the concert deal arrived. And in late 2008, a mysterious figure entered Jackson's life. Or rather, re-entered it. And that was Tomei. Now, Tomei, a man with a deliberately obscured background who represented himself variously as a doctor and orthopedic surgeon, a PhD in economics, and an ambassador at large for Senegal, none of which was true, had been introduced to Jackson through Jermaine. Now, Tomei, working as a consultant for Colony Capital, connected Jackson to Colony's chairman. And Tom Barrick, who connected him to Philip Anschutz, the billionaire owner of AEG Live, the world's second largest concert promoter. A deal began to take shape. And on March 5th, 2009, Jackson appeared at the O2 Arena in London to make the announcement. And between 3,000 and 7,000 fans were waiting, and accounts vary, with AEG's own CEO, Randy Phillips, testifying under oath to the lower number. And 350 journalists had been credentialed, and Jackson arrived 90 minutes late. And when he finally took stage, he looked thin, he looked fragile, and he told the crowd this would be it, the final curtain call. This is it. And he said,
"This is it. This is really it. This is the final curtain call."
And the name stuck, and the concerts would be held at the O2 Arena starting that July, and Jackson had agreed to 10 shows. And within days, AEG expanded the commitment to 50. Roughly 750,000 tickets were sold, generating approximately $85 million in revenue before a single note was performed. And AEG had advanced Jackson close to $30 million in production costs, loans, and living expenses, including $100,000 per month for a mansion in Holmby Hills and a $15 million line of credit. The financial exposure was enormous for both sides. And for AEG, a successful run could generate hundreds of millions, and a global tour beyond London was projected at $450 million or more, and for Jackson, the concerts represented a path out of debt, or, if he couldn't perform, total financial annihilation. Behind the scenes, things were going badly from the start. Randy Phillips, AEG's CEO, sent an email before the March 5th announcement describing Jackson as locked in his room drunk and despondent. And Phillips later testified that he had screamed at Jackson to get him out of the room and had slapped him on the butt to motivate him. And Phillips and Jackson's manager, Frank Delio, had to physically help dress him. And the man who walked on stage and told the world he was ready for his comeback had to be coerced into putting on his clothes. And the rehearsals began in the spring of 2009 at the Staples Center and the Forum in Inglewood. And on good days, Jackson was brilliant. Dancers and musicians who worked with him during this period described flashes of the old magic, moments where his movement and vocal power were fully intact, where you could see the greatest performer of his generation still living inside the increasingly fragile body. And on bad days, he was incoherent. He was cold when the room was warm. He trembled. He couldn't remember choreography he had performed thousands of times, and he was losing weight constantly. And he was not sleeping. And on June 19th, 2009, 6 days before his death, the show's director, Kenny Ortega, sent an email to Randy Phillips with the subject line, "Trouble at the Front." And Ortega described finding Jackson, quote-unquote, lost and incoherent at rehearsal, cold to touch, trembling, unable to perform. And he had wrapped Jackson in blankets and tried to feed him. Quote, "There are strong signs of paranoia, anxiety, and obsessive-like behavior," unquote, Ortega would write. And quote, "I think the very best thing we can do is get a top psychiatrist in to evaluate him ASAP," unquote. So Alif Sankey, an associate producer on the show, was more blunt, saying, quote-unquote, "Michael is dying," she told colleagues. And quote-unquote, "He needs to be put in a hospital." And Phillips' response shut Ortega down, saying, quote, "It is critical that neither you, me, or anyone become amateur psychiatrists or physicians," unquote, he would write. And Phillips described Jackson's personal physician, a cardiologist named Conrad Murray, as, quote-unquote, "extremely successful and totally unbiased and ethical." And he instructed Ortega to defer to Murray's medical judgment. So Dr. Conrad Murray, born February 19th, 1953 in Granada, board eligible but not board certified in cardiology, internal medicine certification lapsed, and no training in anesthesiology, sleep medicine, or pain management, over $4,000 in court judgments, a 2002 bankruptcy, defaulted on his $1.66 million mortgage, child support arrears for children by multiple women, a Las Vegas clinic facing eviction, was about to treat Michael Jackson. Now, he had first met Michael Jackson in December of 2006 through Jackson's children. And by 2009, Jackson had requested that Murray serve as his personal physician for the London concerts. And AEG agreed to pay Murray $150,000 per month, a salary Murray had negotiated down from his initial ask of $5 million per year. He's not even qualified. And the contract contained a provision that gave AEG the power to terminate the agreement if concerts were postponed or canceled, creating what experts would later describe as an egregious conflict of interest. The doctor's income depended on the patient performing. Very bad, and already a unqualified, greedy bastard is now treating Michael Jackson. It's just a nightmare that is about to unfold. But no background check was conducted. An unemployment expert later testified that a $10 search would have revealed Murray's financial desperation, and Murray was administering propofol to Jackson nightly in a bedroom, not a hospital, and he had no pulse oximeter monitoring Jackson's oxygen levels, and he had no capnography equipment to measure exhaled carbon dioxide either, and the oxygen tank in the room was empty, and the pulse oximeter was still in its box unopened. But he was putting a man under general anesthesia every night with no monitoring equipment and no emergency protocols in a rented mansion in Holmby Hills so that the most famous entertainer in history could approximate something that resembled sleep. Absolutely abhorrent. So on the evening of June 24th, 2009, Michael Jackson arrived at the Staples Center for what would be his final rehearsal. And he got there around 6:30 p.m. and worked until approximately 12:30 a.m. on June 25th. And footage from that night, later released as part of the This Is It documentary, shows Jackson performing Earth Song with full commitment, hitting his marks, directing the band. It was one of the good nights. And those who saw him said he looked like Michael Jackson again. And his personal chef, Kai Chase, prepared his dinner, and Jackson ate, then retired to his bedroom on the second floor of Holmby Hills mansion at 100 North Carrollwood Drive. And Dr. Conrad Murphy was with him. And what happened in that bedroom over the next 14 hours is known primarily through Murray's own account, given to police, contested by prosecutors, and never subjected to cross-examination because Murray chose not to testify at either his criminal trial or the AEG wrongful death trial. And according to Murray, Jackson was agitated and unable to sleep. So Murray began administering a sequence of sedatives, escalating through the night as each one failed to produce unconsciousness. So at 1:30 a.m., 10 milligrams of diazepam or Valium intravenously. And at 2 a.m., 2 milligrams of lorazepam or Ativan administered intravenously. And at 3 a.m., 2 milligrams of midazolam or Versed administered intravenously. And at 5 a.m., 2 milligrams of lorazepam again. And at 7:30 a.m., 2 milligrams of midazolam again. But none of it worked. And for 6 hours, Murray pumped Jackson full of benzodiazepines, and Jackson remained awake. His body so conditioned to sedation, so profoundly broken in its ability to achieve natural sleep, that clinical doses of multiple tranquilizers could not bring him down. And according to Murray, Jackson begged for propofol throughout the night, and Murray claimed he resisted. And he claimed he was trying to wean Jackson off the drug. And at approximately 10:40 a.m., Murray administered 25 milligrams of propofol, a dose he described as small, diluted in a lidocaine drip. And by about 10:50 a.m., Jackson was unconscious. And Murray said he then monitored Jackson for approximately 10 minutes. And around 11 a.m., he left the room for about 2 minutes, he claimed. And when he returned, Michael Jackson was not breathing. But the phone records tell a different story about those minutes. Because beginning at 11:18 a.m., Murray made 3 phone calls. A 32-minute call to his Las Vegas office, a 3-minute call to a patient, and an 11-minute call to a Houston colleague. So 47 minutes on the phone. During this time, by his account, his patient was unconscious under propofol with no monitoring equipment. And what happened between approximately 11 a.m. and 12:17 p.m. when bodyguard Alberto Alvarez arrived at the bedroom and found Murray performing what appeared to be CPR on the bed is a gap that has never been fully explained. And Alvarez later testified that when he entered the room, Murray was frantic. And according to Alvarez, Murray grabbed vials from a nightstand and ordered Alvarez to put them in a bag. And Murray then had Alvarez remove an IV bag containing a milky white substance, the color of propofol. And only after these items were concealed, Alvarez testified, did Murray direct him to call 911. And it should be noted that Alvarez made no mention of the vial concealing in his first police interview on June 25th. The account emerged on August 31st after Jackson's cause of death had been made public. And the 911 call was placed at 12:21 p.m., and Alvarez told the dispatcher that a 50-year-old man, he said 50, Jackson was in fact 50, had stopped breathing.
We have a gentleman here that needs help, and he's not breathing yet. He's not breathing, and we're trying to pump him, but he's not breathing. So.
And the dispatcher asked if the patient was on a bed, and he was, and the dispatcher told them to move him to the floor for CPR, and this had not been done. And Murray had been performing chest compressions on a mattress, which he should know if he's a doctor, absorbs the force and renders CPR largely ineffective. And paramedics arrived at 12:26 p.m., and they found Jackson on the bed, and he had been moved to the floor briefly, then returned with an IV in his left leg. His body cool to the touch and his pupils fixed and dilated. And paramedic Richard Seneff estimated based on Jackson's condition that at least 20 minutes had elapsed since cardiac arrest, because Michael Jackson's extremities were beginning to turn blue. And Murray did not tell the paramedics that he had administered propofol, and he did not tell the emergency room doctors at UCLA Medical Center either. And he would never voluntarily disclose the propofol. And the paramedics worked on Jackson at the house and then during transport, and the ambulance left the Carrollwood mansion at 1:07 p.m. and arrived at UCLA Ronald Reagan Medical Center at approximately 1:14 p.m. And emergency physicians continued resuscitation efforts for over an hour. And at 2:26 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time on June 25th, 2009, Michael Joseph Jackson was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. And at 2:44 p.m., 18 minutes after the pronouncement, TMZ published the news. And the story broke not through a hospital statement or a family announcement or a press conference, but through a celebrity gossip website. because that was the world Michael Jackson had lived and died in. And within minutes, the internet buckled, and Google servers registered such a massive spike in search traffic that the company's automated systems interpreted it as a distributed denial of service attack. And Twitter crashed, and Wikipedia crashed, and 15% of all Twitter posts in the hour that followed mentioned Michael Jackson. The servers couldn't hold the grief. And I, like I'm sure many, remember this day, and it is cemented in my brain. What a horribly tragic day. So the Los Angeles County Coroner's autopsy performed the following day established the cause of death as acute propofol intoxication with a contributory benzodiazepine effect, meaning the propofol killed him, and the cascade of sedatives Murray had administered throughout the night made the lethal dose more lethal. And the manner of death was ruled a homicide. And the autopsy revealed a body that told the story of its occupant's life. Jackson stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 136 pounds. His skin showed the depigmentation pattern of vitiligo, confirming the diagnosis he had disclosed 16 years earlier on Oprah's couch. The condition the tabloids had spent decades insisting was voluntary skin bleaching. His heart was healthy, his major organs were functional. There was no cancer, no terminal illness, no underlying condition that would have killed him. Without the propofol, Michael Jackson's body could have continued living. It was not the body that failed, it was the people around his body. So Conrad Murray was charged with involuntary manslaughter on February 8th, 2010, 8 months after Jackson's death. Not murder. Not even second-degree murder, which the LAPD detectives who investigated the case believed the evidence warranted. Lead detectives Orlando Martinez, Dan Myers, and Scott Smith would later state in a 2019 documentary called Killing Michael Jackson that they had pushed for a second-degree murder charge, but the district attorney's office opted for manslaughter. And the trial lasted 6 weeks from September 27th to November 7th, 2011. And the prosecution's case was straightforward. Murray had administered a powerful surgical anesthetic in a home setting without appropriate monitoring equipment, had failed to call 911 promptly, had attempted to conceal evidence, and had never disclosed the propofol to emergency medical personnel. And the defense argued that Jackson had self-administered additional propofol when Murray left the room, an accidental overdose by a desperate addict, not criminal negligence by a doctor. Doctor. Not a doctor at all. And Murray did not take the stand. And on November 7th, 2011, the jury found Conrad Murray guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and he was sentenced on November 29th to 4 years in county jail. 4 years. That was the maximum for the charge. And due to California's overcrowding provisions, he served approximately 2 years before being released on October 28th, 2013. And he later published a memoir titled This Is It, positioning himself as a scapegoat, and he never expressed remorse for Jackson's death, even though it was completely his fault. And then the second trial was civil. Catherine Jackson, Michael's mother, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against AEG Live, seeking between $1.5 and $2 billion in damages. In the case, Catherine Jackson versus AEG Live was the longer and in many ways more revealing proceeding, lasting 5 months with 58 witnesses. And the central question was whether AEG had hired, controlled, or supervised Murray, and whether they bore responsibility for placing a financially desperate, unqualified doctor in charge of Jackson's care. And the evidence that emerged was damning in texture, if not in legal outcome. And AEG's own emails showed executives who knew Jackson was deteriorating and pushed forward anyway. And Paul Gongware, AEG's co-CEO, had written of Murray, quote, "We want to remind him that it is AEG, not Michael Jackson, who is paying his salary. We want him to understand what is expected of him," unquote. No background check had been conducted. The contract gave AEG termination power over Murray's compensation if shows were postponed, meaning the doctor's paycheck depended on his patient performing, as we said before. And Kenny Ortega's trouble at the front email describing Jackson as lost and incoherent 6 days before his death had been answered with Phillips' instructions to stop playing amateur doctor and defer to Murray. And Prince Jackson, Michael's eldest son, 15 years old at the time, testified that his father had told him in tears after phone calls with AEG executives, quote unquote, "They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me." And he named Randy Phillips and Tomei specifically. And on October 2nd, 2013, the jury delivered its verdict. And they found unanimously that AEG Live had indeed hired Conrad Murray. But they also found that Murray was not unfit or incompetent for the job, a conclusion that struck many observers as difficult to reconcile with the facts. Because the jury answered no to the competence question, AEG was found not liable, and the case was over. And the jury foreman later told reporters, quote, "Had the question been, was Murray ethical? It could have been a different outcome," unquote. Just unbelievable, in my opinion. And Katherine Jackson's appeal was rejected by the California Court of Appeals in 2015. And after Jackson's death, Randy Phillips wrote in an email, quote, "AEG will make a fortune from merch sales, ticket retention, the touring exhibition, and the film/DVD," unquote. And unfortunately, he was right. AEG recouped its losses and then some through merchandise, through the 40 to 50% of ticket holders who kept their tickets as souvenirs rather than requesting refunds, and through a 10% stake in This Is It, the concert rehearsal documentary assembled from footage of Jackson's final rehearsals. And the film grossed $267 million worldwide. And it showed Michael Jackson dancing, singing, directing, alive, electric, unmistakably brilliant. The last footage of the greatest performer who ever lived, packaged and sold to the world by the company his son said was going to kill him. So the Los Angeles County coroner ruled the manner of Michael Jackson's death as a homicide, as we know. And Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, a charge that led the LAPD detectives on the case believed should have been second-degree murder. And the official cause was acute propofol intoxication administered by a doctor who should have never been in that bedroom. So for the legal system, the story ends there. But for Jackson's family and for a substantial number of people who have examined the documented evidence, including myself, it does not. And Michael Jackson spent the last years of his life telling the people closest to him that he was going to be killed. And his son, Prince, who testified under oath at the AEG trial in 2013, quote, "After he got off the phone, he would cry. He would say, 'They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me,' unquote." And he named specific people, AEG's Randy Phillips and his former manager, Tomei. And he told Lisa Marie Presley during one of their final conversations in 2005 that someone was going to kill him for his music catalog. And she confirmed on Oprah in 2010 that he gave her names. But as we said before, she declined to share them. And he told his sister, LaToya, quote, "I'm going to be murdered for my music publishing catalog and my estate," unquote.
You've been quoted as saying you believe it may have been murdered. Do you still think that?
Absolutely.
Why?
Absolutely.
Why are you so
I would
sure?
never, ever think differently.
And he told his daughter Paris, who recalled in a 2017 Rolling Stones interview, quote, "He would drop hints about people out to get him. And at some point he was like, 'They're going to kill me one day,' unquote." And handwritten notes attributed to Jackson, shared by a friend and published in 2017, read, quote, "They are trying to murder me, and the system wants to kill me for my catalog," unquote. And his bodyguards, Bill Whitfield and Havon Beard, wrote in their 2014 memoir that Jackson's primary security concern was not fans or strangers, but, quote, "the people who were already in his life. He wanted us there so he could hide his movements from his own lawyers and managers," unquote. And the identity of they shifted over time, and AEG executives, Sony, Tommy Mottola, unnamed catalog seekers, the system. And the warnings were consistent, and the question is what they mean. Prophetic awareness of a genuine conspiracy, or the escalating paranoia of a man whose brain was being ravaged by nightly propofol and regular Demerol injections, substances known to exacerbate anxiety and disordered thinking. And the honest answer is that both could be true simultaneously. And what follows are the major theories presented with the evidence that supports them and the evidence that complicates them. And I want to put a disclaimer that none of these have been proven, but also that none can be entirely dismissed. And the broadest and most legally tested theory holds that AEG Live knowingly pushed a deteriorating Jackson beyond his limits to protect a roughly $30 million investment while hiring a financially desperate doctor they could control. The evidence is substantial, because AEG expanded Jackson's commitment from 10 shows to 50 within days of the announcement, despite handwritten notes attributed to Jackson reading, quote, only agreed to 10 shows, unquote. And their own CEO described Jackson as, quote, locked in his room, drunk and despondent, unquote, before the press conference. And their co-CEO wrote of Murray, quote, we want to remind him that it is AEG, not Michael Jackson, who is paying his salary, unquote. And when Kenny Ortega warned 6 days before Jackson's death that the performer was lost and incoherent and needed a psychiatrist, Randy Phillips told him to stop playing amateur doctor. No background check was conducted on Murray. The contract tied Murray's compensation to the concert's proceedings, and so on. We know this. We know all the information regarding the AEG theory. But after the trial, the jury, while unanimously finding that AEG had hired Murray, concluded he was not unfit or incompetent, and therefore AEG bore no liability. But the counter-argument is real. A living Jackson touring globally over 3 years was projected to generate $450 million or more. And AEG also dropped its own $17.5 million of insurance claim with Lloyd's of London in 2012. Not exactly the behavior of a company that planned a death for profit. I personally think, and you guys can sound off all of what you think in the comments, but I feel like it was in their interest to have Michael actually do those concerts. Did they use him horrifically, and did that lead to his death? Absolutely. But I don't think that was planned, but they were absolutely a giant part of him passing away. And next there is the catalog theory. And this is the theory Jackson himself most explicitly articulated, because his 50% stake in the Sony ATV catalog, purchased in 1985 for $47.5 million, worth approximately $1 billion by 2009 and $4 billion by 2016, made him one of the most valuable targets in the entertainment industry. And he had publicly declared war on Sony in July 2002, calling CEO Tommy Mottola a racist and very, very devilish at Al Sharpton's National Action Network in Harlem. And he accused Sony of sabotaging his album Invincible to force a catalog sale. And by 2009, Jackson had borrowed between $270 and $380 million against his catalog share, held by Fortress Investment Group at 16.8% annual interest, because a default could trigger a forced sale. And Sony held a first right of refusal. So what happened after his death is the theory's most powerful exhibit. So in 2016, Sony bought the estate's 50% of Sony ATV for $750 million. And in 2018, Sony paid $287.5 million for the estate's share of EMI Music Publishing. And in 2024, Sony purchased 50% of Jackson's Vizioc music catalog for over $600 million. Total payments from Sony to the estate now exceed $2 billion. So Sony owns the catalog Jackson swore he would never sell. That's the basis of all of this. So that doesn't look good. Looks like they were constantly waiting to prey upon this sale. But the counter argument would be that Sony could have acquired the catalog through legal financial pressure, and Jackson's mounting debt had a forced sale plausible without violence. And no law enforcement investigation found evidence of a catalog-motivated conspiracy, and Murray's conviction established propofol negligence, not corporate assassination. Now, a narrower version of the conspiracy asks not whether Jackson was murdered by a corporation or a cabal, but whether Murray was specifically selected or allowed to remain because his financial desperation made him controllable and his lack of qualifications made Jackson's death inevitable. Now, to go over Murray again, he owed over $1 million. He had defaulted on a $1.66 million mortgage, and he had $600,000 in court judgments, and he had $71,000 in student loans, child support for children by 6 or 7 women, and a 2002 bankruptcy. and his Las Vegas clinic was being evicted. And he initially asked, as we know, AEG for $5 million per year before accepting $150,000 per month. And LAPD Detective Orlando Martinez testified that Murray's financial situation was a major incentive to break the rules. And his qualifications were grossly inadequate for what he was doing, not board certified in cardiology, internal medicine certification lapsed, no training in anesthesiology or sleep medicine, suspended from hospitals 3 times, and he administered propofol nightly in a bedroom with no pulse oximeter, no capnography, and an empty oxygen tank. And the timeline on June 25th raises its own questions. 47 minutes of phone calls while his patient lay unconscious, a gap of over an hour before 911 was called, and bodyguard testimony about concealing vials before summoning help. Murray never told paramedics or emergency physicians that he had administered propofol. And Paris Jackson was direct, saying, quote, "Absolutely, because it's obvious, all arrows point to that," unquote. And she used air quotes around the word doctor when discussing Murray, which, yeah. And the LAPD detectives who built the case believed the evidence warranted a second-degree murder charge. But, as we're doing for all the other theories, there's the counter-argument. And that is that Murray, the idiot that he is, panicked, had a chaotic response that looked more like incompetence than execution, and if he had been hired to kill, the execution would presumably have been more professional. And Jackson actively sought propofol. Multiple doctors before Murray had refused his requests. So, I don't know. I would love to know what you guys think down below. And the next one is that Jackson was approximately $500 million in debt at the time of his death. And his estate has since generated roughly $3.5 billion. And Joe Jackson said it publicly, saying, quote, "He's worth more dead than he was alive," unquote. And the IRS argued the same point during tax proceedings. And Forbes named Jackson the top earning dead celebrity in nearly every year since 2009, peaking at $825 million in 2016. And the This Is It documentary grossed $267 million, and the Cirque du Soleil residency generated over $160 million, and the Broadway musical grossed approximately $300 million, and the estate cleared all $500 million in debt and is currently valued at $2 to $2.5 billion. And the counter-argument is just timing, because this success was not foreseeable in 2009. And a living Jackson completing a 3-year global tour was the most immediately profitable scenario for everyone involved. And the worth more dead than alive observation is retrospective, powerful as rhetoric, but weak as evidence of any premeditation. And then there's Dr. Arnold Klein. Now, Dr. Arnold Klein, Jackson's longtime Beverly Hills dermatologist, administered over 200 Demerol injections across decades, with records kept under the alias Omar Arnold. And in the 4 months before Jackson's death, the doses escalated dramatically, 375 milligrams in 3 hours on April 22, 2009, and 900 milligrams over 3 days in May. And his last appointment was June 22nd, 3 days before death. And when he received 100 milligrams, a typical anxiety dose is 50 milligrams, just so you know. Murray's defense argued the chain explicitly, that Klein's Demerol created dependency, withdrawal caused insomnia, insomnia drove propofol use, and propofol killed him. And Demerol's short half-life meant none appeared in the autopsy, but withdrawal symptoms from the June 22nd injection would have been active on June 25th. So Klein was investigated by the DEA and the California Medical Board, but never charged. And he filed for bankruptcy in 2011 and died in 2015 at the age of 70. And the mainstream interpretation is that Klein was an enabler in a system of medical exploitation, not a conspirator, but a link in the chain that killed Michael Jackson nonetheless. And now the most enigmatic figure in Jackson's final years was his manager, Tomei, a man who represented himself as a Lebanese doctor, orthopedic surgeon, PhD in economics, and ambassador at large for Senegal. But under cross-examination at an IRS tax trial, he admitted he had never attended medical school and did not hold a PhD. And the Senegalese embassy confirmed he was not their ambassador. So Tomei entered Jackson's life in late 2007 through Jermaine Jackson, working as a consultant for Colony Capital at $20,000 per month. And he connected Jackson to Colony's Tom Barrack, who connected him to AEG's Philip Anschutz. And Tomei negotiated the "this is it" deal, and his financial arrangements were extraordinarily favorable. A $35,000 monthly management fee, 15% commission on all Jackson's earnings, which is crazy, and $100,000 per month as a concert producer, and a $2.3 million finder's fee for a Neverland loan, and 10% of any future Neverland sale. But Jackson fired Tomei on May 5th, 2009, 7 weeks before his death. And Tomei reportedly responded with rage, threatening to bring death and destruction on Michael Jackson. But despite being fired, Tomei denied his termination, continued identifying himself as Jackson's manager, and on the day of Jackson's death, spoke as his representative at UCLA Medical Center. Just a scum-of-the-earth piece of shit. And a taped conversation from September 2008 captures Jackson's own unease, saying, quote, "This guy has ways about him. There's a divide between me and my representatives, and I don't talk to my lawyer, my accountant," unquote. And Prince Jackson named Tomei by name in his sworn testimony. And the estate later sued Tomei for financial exploitation, and the case settled in 2019 for $3 million. And the counter-argument is basically that Tomei was not at that mansion on June 25th. And there is no actual tangible evidence that connects him to the Propofol administration and a lawsuit alleged financial exploitation, not necessarily murder. And beyond the major theories lie smaller, less substantiated claims. 5 of the Jackson siblings alleged in 2012 that his July 7th, 2002 will was forged, claiming he was in New York City at an Al Sharpton event on the date it was supposedly signed in Los Angeles. And the legal challenges were rejected by every court that heard them, and from LA Supreme Court through the California Supreme Court. Jackson's entertainment attorney Peter Lopez was found dead from a gunshot wound on April 30th, 2010, less than a year after Jackson's death, ruled an apparent you-know-what. And conspiracy theorists noted a cluster of connected deaths in the months after Jackson's. Evan Chandler had died by you-know-what in November of 2009, and Bruce Ayers, a former Klein employee, in December of 2009, and Lopez. And Canadian journalist Ian Halperin predicted in December of 2008, 6 months before the death, that Jackson had 6 months to live. And his conclusion was, quote, "Greed killed Michael Jackson," unquote. But no court and no law enforcement investigation and no credible journalistic inquiry has established that Michael Jackson was deliberately murdered as part of a conspiracy. And the official cause of death is acute propofol intoxication due to criminally negligent care by a doctor who was convicted and served 2 years, which is garbage, in my opinion. And a 5-month civil trial found AEG not liable, yet the documented record provides substantial material for those who believe the story is incomplete. And Jackson repeatedly warned he would be killed, naming specific individuals in his son's sworn testimony, but the coroner ruled the manner of death a homicide. And Katherine Jackson would say in 2011, quote, "If such evidence ever comes to my attention, I will be the first to bring those facts to light," unquote. But the evidence still has not arrived, but the questions have not gone away. And on July 7th of 2009, 12 days after his death, Michael Jackson was memorialized at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, and 17,500 tickets were distributed by lottery from a pool of over 1 million applicants. And an estimated 2.5 billion people watched globally, though that figure is essentially unverifiable. And Stevie Wonder performed, and Mariah Carey performed, and Usher approached the open casket and broke down. And Jennifer Hudson sang, "Will You Be There?" And Smokey Robinson read from the Bible, and Brooke Shields, one of Jackson's closest friends, described the boy she had known since they were both teenagers, 2 of the most famous children in the world, finding refuge in each other's company. And Berry Gordy, the man who had signed the Jackson 5 4 decades earlier, called him the greatest entertainer that ever lived. And Reverend Al Sharpton addressed Jackson's 3 children directly.
Wasn't nothing strange about your daddy. It was strange what your daddy had to deal with.
And the moment that silenced the arena came at the end, with Paris Jackson, 11 years old, stepped to the microphone.
Ever since I was born, Daddy has been the best father you could ever imagine. And I just wanted to say I love him so much.
And she could not finish, so Janet Jackson held her. And Michael Jackson would then be buried on September 3rd, 2009 at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, interred in the Holly Terrace section of the Great Mausoleum. So he would forever be remembered as the greatest performer who ever lived. But those questions are still being asked to this day, mostly in why did he actually die? Because it's hard to even accept what came to be. And for a while, it seemed like the story might end there, with the gold casket, the tearful daughter, the billion-dollar estate slowly paying off a dead man's debts. The world moved on the way it always does. Jokes faded, and the music came back on the radio, and the conspiracy theories settled into the corners of the internet where conspiracy theories live. So it seemed Michael Jackson finally was being allowed to rest. Until a decade later. So a decade after Jackson's death, the allegations would return. And on January 25th, 2019, the documentary Leaving Neverland premiered at a Sundance Film Festival, directed by Dan Reed. And the 4-hour film featured two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, describing in graphic detail what they said were years of by Jackson during their childhoods. And Robson was the same choreographer who had testified under oath at Jackson's 2005 criminal trial that he had never been abused. And he reversed his position in 2013, filing a civil claim against the estate. And Safechuck filed a similar claim. And the documentary was devastating in its impact. And it won a Primetime Emmy Award, and radio stations pulled Jackson's music from rotation. And The Simpsons removed an episode featuring his voice, and statues were taken down, and the cultural reassessment was swift and severe. And the Jackson estate responded with a $100 million lawsuit against HBO, alleging the network had violated a non-disparagement clause from a 1992 concert film agreement. And the legal battle over the Robson and Safechuck claims continues, and a trial is actually scheduled for November 2026. And the estate has denied all allegations and has pointed to Robson's prior sworn testimony, inconsistencies in the accuser's timelines, and the 2005 jury's unanimous acquittal. And the documentary did not settle the question that has followed Michael Jackson since 1993. It just deepened it. And then, just as the world thought it had heard everything there was to hear about Michael Jackson, just as the debate between defenders and accusers had calcified into two immovable camps, a dead man's filing cabinet blew the conversation wide open again. And in January 2024, and again in December of 2025, and again in January of 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice released millions of pages of documents, images, and videos related to Jeffrey Epstein, whom I have spoken about at length on this channel. And Michael Jackson's name appeared in the files. And for a man who had spent the last 16 years of his life under suspicion involving children and who had been fully acquitted, the mere appearance of his name in Epstein records detonated across social media with predictable ferocity and minimal context. And the actual content of the files tells a narrow story. And the key testimony comes from Joanna Joberg, an Epstein victim, who stated in a 2016 deposition that she met Michael Jackson at Epstein's house in Palm Beach. And when lawyers asked whether she had given Michael Jackson a massage, standard questioning since massages were a known euphemism in Epstein's operation, Joberg's answer was unequivocal: "I did not." And no allegation of inappropriate conduct by Jackson appears anywhere in the files. No victim has accused him of anything. And on December 19th, 2025, the DOJ released over 300,000 pages of documents, including previously unseen photographs, and 2 images involved Jackson. The first showed him posing with Epstein at the Palm Beach house, and Jackson in a suit and dark sunglasses, and Epstein casually dressed, standing in front of a painting. And the second showed Jackson with Bill Clinton and Diana Ross, with children's faces redacted. And that photo was taken at a Democratic National Committee fundraiser at the Apollo Theater in Harlem on April 24, 2002. And there was no record that Epstein was present at that event. And the image was simply found among Epstein's possessions. And White House Deputy Press Secretary Abigail Jackson was subsequently called out for inserting the Apollo photo into social media posts implying it depicted the trio with Epstein's victims. The children in the photo were Michael Jackson and Diana Ross's own children. And Matt Fides, Jackson's bodyguard for approximately a decade, provided immediate context for the Epstein photo. And he stated it was taken in 2003 during a week of house hunting in Palm Beach, and Jackson was considering a move to be closer to his friend Barry Gibb, with whom he was recording daily. And Epstein's residence was one of roughly 30 properties they toured with a real estate agent. And the encounter lasted no more than half a minute. A polite greeting and a photograph. Quote, "We never even knew who Epstein was," unquote, Fights writes, and quote, "He was not famous then," unquote. Connection to James Maiskin, a real estate figure arranging property viewings for Jackson, whose attorney had a link to Epstein's circle. And CBS News and other outlets noted that Epstein routinely collected photographs with celebrities to project social legitimacy, because we know he was a monster piece of shit who just needed to look famous all the time. But Michael Jackson's name does not appear in Epstein's contact book at all. And it does not appear in the flight logs of Epstein's private planes either. And there are no emails, letters, phone records, financial transactions, or any evidence of further contact between the two beyond that single house viewing encounter for half a minute. And as of February 2026, apart from Epstein himself, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jean-Luc Brunel, no individual has been charged with a crime connected to the Epstein files, as we know if you have watched this channel. And hundreds of public figures appear in the documents without any allegation of wrongdoing. But for Michael Jackson, the Epstein files are ultimately notable for what they do not contain. But the damage was already done, not by the files themselves, but by the headlines that outran them. So another cycle of suspicion and another wave of context arriving too late to catch the accusation. And it's the story of Michael Jackson's entire afterlife. The truth never moves as fast as the rumor. And yet, somehow, neither does the music. Because underneath all of it, the trials, the conspiracies, the files, the documentaries, the arguments that will outlive everyone reading this, there is still the work. And the work refuses to disappear. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, in a 672 square foot house in Gary, Indiana. He died on June 25, 2009, in a rented mansion in Los Angeles at the age of 50. And between those 2 points, he became the most famous person on the planet and one of the most complicated figures the American century ever produced. And the arguments about what he was and was done to him show no signs of ending. But the music, at least, is settled. And it is as close to permanent as anything human beings have made. And that is that for Michael Jackson. This was a long one. You guys have asked me to deep dive into multiple figures like Marilyn Monroe and Princess Diana and Michael Jackson. If you have anybody else you want me to deep dive into, let me know down below. I always read the comments. And until then, I will see your beautiful face. All right?